The wind in this part of the country did not whisper, it scoured. It came from a flat, sun-blasted horizon and carried the grit of 1,000 miles, painting the town of Redemption Creek in a uniform coat of dull red. It was Saturday, sometime around 1882, maybe 1883, and the market was a small, brave noise against the silence of the prairie. Hoofbeats were a dull percussion on the packed earth, punctuated by the sharp, rhythmic ringing of steel from the blacksmith's shed. The air was a fight between smells, the hot iron and coal smoke from the forge, the sour tang of unwashed bodies, and, from one small stall near the end, the defiant scent of yeast and baked crust. Nora stood behind that stall. She was a woman built on a large scale, broad in the shoulder and deep in the chest, with hands that looked like they could handle a plow horse. Today. Her size felt less like strength and more like a heavy, sodden blanket she was forced to wear under the relentless sun. The black bombazine of her morning dress was thick, and the dust had already settled into its weave, turning her grief into a public, gritty spectacle. It had been 6 weeks. 6 weeks since the bleed and the panic, the tiny, perfect fingernails of the son she never heard cry, the shallow grave dug by her own hands behind the boarding house. 6 weeks since the world had shrunk to the space between her aching breasts and her empty arms. Her milk had come in, a bitter miracle, and then, slowly, painfully, it had dried up, leaving her feeling hollowed out, a dry well. A woman, the wife of the town's banker, approached. Her skirts were a crisp blue, held high to avoid the filth. She pointed at a loaf, a round, high crown of bread with a dark, glossy crust. "That one," she said. Her voice was as thin and sharp as a needle. Nora wrapped the loaf in a square of clean, rough-spun cloth. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Her shoulders screamed from the pre-dawn labor of kneading. She had woken at 4 a.m, the floorboards of her small room at Mrs. Gable's boarding house cold as ice beneath her bare feet. She had hauled the wood, stoked the communal oven, her hands already coated in flour before the first light had broken. The banker's wife placed 2 coins on the rough plank table. She did not look Nora in the face. She looked at Nora's hands, then at her waist, a quick, assessing glance that catalogued everything the widow's weeds, the absence of a wedding band, the heavy, solid flesh. It was a look Nora had come to know well. It was the look of polite cruelty. It was the social equivalent of spitting. Done with the chin high and the eyes cold, Nora slid the coins into the wooden box beneath the table. The box was light. It held nowhere near the $50 she owed Mrs. Gable. 3 months of rent, 3 months of the landlady's pursed lips and pointed reminders about the cost of firewood, 3 months of sleeping under a roof that was not hers, haunted by the ghost of a man she had been relieved to bury. Her husband, Daniel, had been a man of loud-voiced charms and a fast, heavy hand. He had died just as he lived, full of cheap whiskey and bad intentions, falling from a horse he had stolen and breaking his neck in a dry creek bed. The town had called it a tragedy. Nora called it Tuesday. His death had left her with nothing but his name, his debts, and the child in her belly that he had never wanted. Now, she was alone, a large, solitary woman in a town that prized families and feared God, in that order. The moral order of Redemption Creek was as strict and unyielding as the landscape. Justice was not found in the sheriff's office. It was dispensed in whispers over clotheslines and in the silent, collective judgment of the congregation on Sunday. The reverend's sermons were full of fire and brimstone, and he spoke often of the idle hands and the wayward woman. Nora, unmarried, childless, and visibly poor, was a walking sermon for him. She was a living example of what happened when a woman was left without the guidance of a man or the grace of God, or so they whispered. She felt the weight of their scrutiny every day. It was a physical thing, like the heat of the sun, pressing down on her shoulders. She was too big, She took up too much space. Her grief was too raw, her loss too recent. They did not want to see it. They did not want to be reminded that life was so fragile, that a child could be lost, that a woman could be left with nothing but the stubborn will to bake bread. The silence from her customers was its own kind of violence. They came, they pointed, they paid, they left. They did not ask how she was. They did not offer a kind word. Her bread was good. It was, perhaps, the only honest living thing in her life. It was a connection to a part of herself that had not died, the part that understood the alchemy of flour, water, yeast, and heat. The loaves were heavy and dense, life-giving. She sold life, and in return, she was treated like a ghost. The dust dried her lips. She licked them, tasting the grit, and her hand went instinctively to the small, empty space in her apron where her son should have been. The movement was involuntary, a muscle memory of a future that would never happen. A sharp, stinging guilt lanced through her. She was cursed. That was the word that circled in her mind, a vulture in the empty sky of her thoughts. Cursed to lose, cursed to endure, cursed to be this heavy, useless body. She sold another loaf, this time to a cowboy who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. He, at least, met her eyes. He gave her a jerky nod, his gaze lingering on the bread with genuine hunger, not on her body with open scorn. He paid his nickel and moved on, and she felt a small, sharp pang of gratitude that was almost as painful as the scorn. Late in the afternoon, when the sun began its brutal descent and the shadows of the stalls stretched long and thin, Martha arrived. Martha was as old as the hills and twice as dried, her skin a map of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and black as a magpie's. She sold dried herbs, strange roots, and folk remedies from a blanket spread on the ground. The town's doctor, a young man with a framed diploma and soft hands, called her a charlatan. But when his own wife had been gripped by the fever, it was Martha's willow bark tea he had sent for in the dead of night. Martha stopped at Nora's stall. She did not look at the bread. She looked at Nora. Her gaze was not the banker's wife's. It was a far-seeing, practical gaze that missed nothing: the weariness in Nora's shoulders, the cracked, dry skin of her hands, the dullness in her eyes. "You are not sleeping," Martha stated. It was not a question. "There is work," Nora said, her voice rough from disuse. "Work is one thing," Martha said, shifting the bundle of sage she carried. "Grief is another. Do not let one kill you while you are running from the other." She reached into her deep apron pocket and pulled out a small twist of dried leaves. "Catnip," she said, "for tea. It will not bring him back, but it will let you rest." She pushed it onto the table, her gnarled hand resting for a moment near Nora's. She did not ask for payment. Nora looked at the small, free offering, and a hot, painful lump rose in her throat. She had not cried in 6 weeks. She would not cry now, not here, not in front of the town. She swallowed, the motion painful, and nodded. "Thank you, Martha," she whispered. Martha grunted, a sound that was almost kind. "The bread is good," she said, her sharp eyes moving to the remaining loaves. "It has a strong heart, like the woman who bakes it." She moved on, leaving Nora with the scent of sage and the small bundle of leaves. A strong heart. The words were a shock. No one had called her strong. They had called her big, unfortunate, poor, but not strong. The market was thinning. The blacksmith's hammer was silent. The air grew cooler, the dust settling as the wind died down to a tired sigh. Nora began to pack her empty cloths and the few loaves she had not sold. She would eat one for supper. The other she would try to trade with Mrs. Gable, perhaps for a little bacon fat. The tension of the day, the slow, grinding misery of being invisible and observed at the same time, had settled into a dull ache behind her eyes. The day was over. She had survived. That was the only victory she allowed herself. She looked up, one last time, At the long, empty street, the sun was a smear of blood orange in the west. The town was pulling in on itself, doors closing, lanterns being lit, families sitting down to supper. She was on the outside, as always. The silence of the prairie was rolling in, and it felt vast and hungry. It was a silence that promised another day just like this one. But as she tied the last knot on her bundle, she felt a change in the air. It was not the wind, it was a sound, a new sound, thin and desperate, cutting through the weary rhythms of the closing market. It was a sound that had been torn from her own throat 6 weeks ago, a sound she thought she would never hear again. It was the weak, failing cry of a baby, and it was getting closer. The cry was thin, more of a rasp than a wail. It was the sound of a creature that had been screaming for hours and was now down to its last, frayed thread of life. Nora's hand, which had been tying off the bundle of unsold bread, froze. Every maternal instinct she had spent the last 6 weeks trying to bury, trying to drown in work and numb grief, surged to the surface. It was a physical jolt, as if lightning had struck the dusty street. Her dry breasts ached, a phantom, stinging pain that stole her breath. The remaining sounds of the market died, the rattle of a closing shutter, the jingle of a harness, the low murmur of tired gossip. It all stopped. The crowd, a moment ago a scattered collection of individuals, now became a single, silent entity, and it was parting, like a sluggish, dirty river splitting around a rock. The people stepped back, clearing a path down the center of the main street. At the end of that path was the man and the sound. He was tall, a cowboy by his worn boots and the set of his broad shoulders, though he was stooped now, hollowed out by an exhaustion that went bone deep. His face was obscured by a rough, matted beard, his hat long gone. His shirt, once a pale blue, was stiff with patches of dark, dried blood that flaked at the edges. He was stumbling more than walking, his gaze frantic, scanning the faces that turned away from him. In his arms, he held a bundle. It was a small, filthy blanket, and from it issued that terrible, dying cry. He staggered to a halt in the center of the cleared space, right where the banker's wife had stood hours earlier. He looked down at the bundle, his entire body trembling. "Please," he rasped. His voice was raw, broken. "Someone, please." The baby, for it was unmistakably a baby, let out another cry, this one so weak it was barely more than a sigh. The man adjusted the blanket, and Nora saw the child's head. It was tiny, covered in a cap of dark, matted hair. The skin was a dreadful, mottled gray, the color of ash. Its eyes were squeezed shut, its mouth a tiny, desperate O in a face that looked ancient with suffering. It was not breathing right, its small chest hitched, a shallow, stuttering motion. Then the whispers began. They rippled through the crowd, a venomous, self-righteous tide. "That's him. That's Hayes. Thomas Hayes, the one who struck the Reverend. Right in the churchyard. Sinner's rage, that is. No wonder God turned his face." A woman in a sharp-brimmed bonnet, one of Mrs. Gable's permanent boarders, added her voice, pitched for all to hear. His wife, Sarah, she died birthing that, died all alone. He came screaming for the doctor. But who'd go out to that man's ranch? "They say he threatened the doctor last spring over a card game," her companion added, enjoying the drama. "Shame. Really, the wife pays the price for the husband's temper?" "He punched a man of God," the first woman concluded, as if this settled all accounts. "And now he wants help from God-fearing folk. The nerve." The man, Thomas Hayes, seemed to hear none of it, or perhaps he had heard it all before. He was locked in a private hell. His world shrunk to the dying creature in his arms. He looked up, his eyes wild and bloodshot, finding the small cluster of women near the dress shop. "Please," he begged, taking a step toward them. "My wife. She's gone. The baby. He hasn't eaten, not in 2 days. He won't take the sugar water. I need a woman, a nursing woman." He held the blanket out. "Could you nurse him just this once I have money? I'll pay anything, just this once." The baby was, in fact, a girl, Grace. But in his panic, the word him was what came out, a generic plea for a life. The distinction was lost, unimportant. What mattered was the desperation. The women he had approached recoiled. It was not a subtle movement. They physically flinched, their hands flying to their chests, their skirts rustling as they stepped back, pulling their own children behind them. Their faces, which had been alive with cruel gossip, now snapped shut, becoming hard, smooth masks of piety and refusal. They looked at the dried blood on his shirt, at the gray-skinned infant, and they saw not tragedy, but contamination. They saw a moral leper. The men were no better. They looked away, suddenly fascinated by the dust on their boots, the sign on the saloon, the empty sky. To help this man was to stand with him, to stand against the judgment of the Reverend, to stand against the entire social order of Redemption Creek. It was too high a price. They were farmers and merchants, not heroes. They chose, as one, their own moral safety. The silence that followed was louder than the baby's cry. It was the sound of a community making a decision, the sound of a door being bolted. Thomas Hayes understood. A sound of pure despair. A low, animal groan tore from his chest. He slumped, his shoulders bowing, the last of his fight gone. He looked down at the child, as if to say, "I tried." "That widow." The voice was sharp, dry, and carried like a bugle call. It was Martha. The old woman had not moved from her spot. She was sitting on her blanket, but her arm was outstretched, a long, bony finger pointing directly, unequivocally, at Nora. "That widow might still have milk," Martha announced to the street. "She lost her own but 6 weeks back." If the silence before had been loud, this new silence was a physical weight. It was the sound of 100 indrawn breaths. Every eye in the market, the banker's wife, the whispering women from the boarding house, the men who had looked away. Even Thomas Hayes himself swiveled and fixed on Nora. She was trapped. She was pinned by their collective gaze, a bug on a board. Her hand, which had been frozen on her unsold loaf, began to tremble. 6 weeks. The words hit her like a punch. The memory she fought every hour rose up and choked her. The cold, small room, the smell of blood and fear, the tiny, still form she had wrapped in her own shawl, her body, her failed, monstrous body, which had brought forth death instead of life. The curse. "I am cursed." The baby in the man's arms let out one more thready noise. It was a sound that cut through her terror. It was the sound of life asking. She looked at the child, gray skin, shallow breath. She knew those signs. She had seen them on her own son just before the end. This child had minutes, maybe an hour, not 2 days' worth of life left in it. A part of her, the deep, animal part that understood motherhood as a force beyond God or gossip, screamed at her to move. It was a call that bypassed her brain, her grief, her shame. It was a pull, a physical, undeniable command. Save him. But the fear was just as strong, the fear of the curse. If she took this child, would God strike it down too, just to punish her? Was she a vessel of death to try, and to fail again, to have this tiny death on her hands as well as her son's? It would not just break her, it would annihilate her. The two forces tore her in half, the need to save, the terror of failing. A noise snapped her out of her paralysis. It was a laugh. It was not a kind laugh. It was a short, sharp, ugly bark of derision. Mrs. Gable, her landlady, stood with the wife of the Reverend. They were watching Nora, and they were smiling. "Her Mrs.," Gable said, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "With her milk, that child's had enough bad luck. I'd say, probably sour as the mother." It was a whip-crack of verbal violence, aimed and delivered with perfect, spiteful precision. It was meant to put Nora back in her place, to remind her that she was the large, grieving, indebted outcast, that she had no power here. The words found their mark in the man, Thomas Hayes. He had been staring at Nora with a desperate, drowning hope. But at the landlady's words, his head snapped up. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by a sudden, blazing fire. His entire body tensed, his hand, the one not supporting the baby, clenched into a fist at his side. He took a step toward Mrs. Gable, a low growl starting in his chest. Nora saw it, the same blind male rage that had killed her husband, the same rage the town accused this man of. He was about to prove them right. He was about to destroy his last and his child's last chance. Don't. The word was quiet, but it cut through the air with absolute authority. Nora's hand, the one that had been trembling, was now steady. She had stepped out from behind her stall. She had placed her hand on Thomas Hayes's arm, on the bunched, trembling muscle of his clenched fist. Her touch was not soft. It was firm, heavy, and undeniable. It was the touch of a woman who had hauled wood and kneaded dough, a touch that meant stop. He froze. The fire in his eyes did not die, but it wavered. Confused, he looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. Nora did not look at the crowd. She did not look at Mrs. Gable or the Reverend's wife. She did not look at Martha. She looked only at Thomas Hayes. She saw the despair, the rage, the grief, and the shred of hope he was clinging to. She did not offer comfort or pity. She offered a fact. "She will not last the walk back to your ranch," Nora said. Her voice was low, rusty, but it held the same strength that was in her hands. "She needs warmth, and she needs it now." She pulled her hand back from his arm. She turned and began to re-tie the bundle of bread. "My room is at the Gable boarding house," and she said, her back to him. 2 blocks north, the gray building with the sagging porch, 2nd floor, last door on the left. She finished her knot. She slung the bundle over one shoulder, the weight settling on her as it did every evening. She picked up her empty coin box with her other hand. She turned, and for the first time, she met the gaze of the crowd. Her eyes were not angry. They were not sad. They were simply empty of fear. She had been judged, and she had survived. She looked at Mrs. Gable, whose mouth was still open in a small O of surprise. Then she looked back at Thomas Hayes, who was watching her as if she were a vision. "Are you coming?" she asked. She did not wait for an answer. She turned and began to walk, her large, solid form moving with a steady, unhurried pace, away from the market, away from the whispers, and toward the cheap, cold room that was the only home she had. For a long moment, Thomas Hayes did not move. The crowd held its breath. Then, clutching the gray, dying child to his chest, he began to follow. Nora did not have to light a lamp. The room was on the west side, and the last, angry light of the setting sun flooded it, illuminating every detail of its poverty. It was an attic space, tucked under the eaves, the ceiling sloping so sharply that a tall man could not have stood upright except in the very center. The air was hot and smelled of old wood, lye soap, and the faint, lingering scent of baked bread. There was a single, narrow cot pressed against one wall, covered with a quilt so worn and mended it was more stitches than original fabric. A small, 3-legged table held a wash basin and a pitcher, both of which were cracked but spotlessly clean. A single wooden chair stood by the small window. On the wall opposite the bed, a small mirror hung from a nail, its glass fractured by a spiderweb of cracks, reflecting the room in broken, disjointed pieces. Nora moved to the cot and laid her bundle of bread and her coin box at its foot. She did not sit. She turned and faced the man who stood panting in the doorway, filling it, his large frame and his raw panic seeming to suck all the air from the small space. He was looking around, his eyes wide, taking in the meanness of the room. It was clear he had expected. Nora did not know what he had expected. A home, perhaps, not this, not a cell. She's colder, he choked out, his voice cracking. Nora's gaze dropped to the bundle in his arms. The baby, Grace, had stopped crying. Her tiny gray face was slack, her mouth open. There was no more time for fear. The curse, the gossip, the staring eyes in the street had all evaporated. There was only the room, the dying child, and the biological imperative that screamed in Nora's blood. "Give her to me," she commanded. Her voice was not kind. It was the voice of a general on a battlefield. He hesitated, his arms tightening. "Now," Nora said. He stumbled forward and placed the child in her outstretched hands. The baby was terrifyingly light, a small, cold weight that barely registered. Her swaddling, a man's torn shirt, was damp and foul. "Sit," Nora said, pointing to the single wooden chair, "and be silent." He collapsed onto the chair, his hands dangling between his knees. His head bowed. He looked like a man who had just been shot. Nora turned her back to him, a deliberate act of privacy. She sat on her cot, the child in her lap. She unwrapped the filthy rags. The baby was a girl, as he had said. So small her ribs were visible as tiny, perfect arches under her mottled skin. She was cold to the touch. Nora unbuttoned the high, tight collar of her black mourning dress. She unbuttoned the front, exposing the plain cotton chemise beneath. She laid the baby against her own skin, tucking the tiny, cold body against the warmth of her breast, skin to skin. She pulled the edges of her dress around the child, and then, for more warmth, she dragged the heavy, mended quilt over both of them, creating a small, dark, warm tent. She held the child. She did not move. She just sat, breathing in, breathing out, forcing the heat from her own large, living body into the child's small, dying one. She could feel the baby's shallow, hitched breathing against her ribs. "Please," Nora whispered, her voice inaudible, her lips moving against the baby's fine, matted hair. "Please, child, try. Just try." She waited. A minute passed, 2. The sun dipped lower, and the light in the room turned from orange to a deep, bruised purple. She could hear the man on the chair behind her, his breathing a harsh, tearing sound in the quiet. The baby stirred. It was a tiny movement, a reflexive rooting, the mouth turning, seeking. Nora shifted, her heart a heavy, painful drum in her chest. She had done this 6 weeks ago with her own son, and nothing had happened. Her breasts were dry, aching, useless. The milk was gone. But the instinct was stronger than the reality. She guided the baby's mouth. Nothing. The child's lips were dry, cracked. She was too weak. "Please," Nora whispered again, a prayer against her own brokenness. "There is nothing else. Please, child, live." She felt a flicker against her skin, the tiny mouth, guided by an instinct that was almost extinguished, latched on. It was a weak, fumbling attempt, a butterfly's touch, and then it tightened. A jolt, sharp as a needle, shot through Nora. It was a biological shock, a deep, forgotten pull, and in response, her body, which had betrayed her, which had been dry for weeks, answered, a single, slow, miraculous drop, and then another. Her milk, which had retreated in grief, came back, called forth by the desperate pull of a life that was not hers. The baby gave a small, choked gasp, and then she began to drink. It was not a strong, healthy suckling. It was a desperate, ragged, stopping and starting pull, but it was happening. The child was drinking. Nora shut her eyes. The hot, painful lump that she had swallowed at the market, the one she had held down for 6 weeks, broke free. A single, hot tear slid from the corner of her eye and traced a path through the flour dust on her cheek. She did not make a sound. Behind her, she heard the man stand up. She heard the scrape of the chair. She did not turn. "Is she—" he started, his voice a raw whisper. "She is drinking," Nora said, her own voice thick. A sound ripped through the small room. It was a sound of a man being broken open, a terrible, wrenching sob of pure, undiluted relief. Thomas Hayes fell to his knees by the washstand. He put his head in his hands, and he wept. his big shoulders shaking, the sounds tearing out of him, the sounds of 2 days of terror, of his wife's death, of his own failure. He cried for his wife, for his child, and for the fact that this strange, large woman in a widow's dress had just performed a miracle. Nora let him cry. She sat, a large, dark, unmoving mountain, and she nursed the baby. She did not know how long they stayed like that. The light was almost gone, the room deep in shadow, when the baby finally let go, her belly full, her face no longer gray. It was flushed, a deep, healthy, sleeping pink. Her breathing was even, deep. Nora carefully rebuttoned her dress, one-handed, wrapping the baby in the quilt to keep her warm. She turned, finally, to the man. He was quiet now, his face buried in a dirty rag, his shoulders still hitching. "She is asleep," Nora said. He got to his feet, wiping his face, shame and gratitude fighting for space in his expression. I don't know." A loud, sharp rap on the door cut him off. It was not a polite knock. It was a summons. The door flew open without a reply. Mrs. Gable stood there, her arms crossed, her face a mask of sour righteousness. Behind her, in the hall, were 2 of the other boarders, their faces craning to see the sin. "Well, Mrs., Gable said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "It did not take you long. Nora, widowed not 2 months, and already bringing men to your room, and with your services." The word hung in the air, ugly and precise. Thomas Hayes had been a broken man seconds before. He was not a broken man now. Nora saw the change. His head came up. The muscles in his neck and shoulders went rigid. His hands, which had been trembling, balled into the same fists she had seen in the market. He took 1 step toward the landlady, his eyes narrowing to black slits. "You will apologize to her," he said. His voice was not loud. It was a low, lethal growl. Mrs. Gable, for the first time, looked afraid. She had been baiting a widow. She had not counted on the wolf. But her pride was stronger than her fear. "I will not," she snapped, her courage returning. "I run a respectable house, and I'll have you know, sir, that this woman owes me 3 months' rent, $50. She pays me or she leaves, and you with her. It was a tactical error. She had given him a target." "You will not speak to her that way," Thomas said, taking another step. "Not again." "Stop!" Nora's voice, it was not loud, but it was absolute. Thomas froze, caught in the act. He looked back at Nora, the rage still burning in him. Nora was standing now, the sleeping child secure in the crook of one arm. She looked at Mrs. Gable. She was not angry. She was not afraid. She was just done. "He is right," Nora said, her voice clear and carrying in the small room. "You will not speak to me that way again, because I will not be here to hear it." She looked at Thomas. "How far is your ranch?" He was stunned, the anger draining out of him, leaving him confused. It's half a day's ride, maybe 12, 15 miles. "She cannot go that long without feeding," Nora said. It was a fact, not a negotiation. "Twice a day. She needs to be fed, at least twice a day, morning and evening." A fragile agreement hung in the air. Mrs. Gable saw her $50 disappearing, and her face hardened. "So, you'll be sneaking this sinner in and out? I think not. Not in my house." The other women in the hall murmured their agreement. The whispers started, the same ones from the market. Shameful, in her own room, with her husband barely cold. Thomas looked at Nora, then at the baby, then at the venomous faces in the hallway. He saw the trap. He could not stay here. He could not take the baby away. "Come with me," he said to Nora, the words abrupt. Nora stared at him. "What?" "Come with me," he repeated, his voice gaining strength, an idea forming. "To the ranch, just for a few weeks until she is stronger, until I can find a wet nurse, a proper one. I cannot, Nora, I cannot lose her. She's all I have left." He was pleading. "I will pay you, whatever you ask. You'll have your own room, a good one. It was my wife's. No, it was the hired hand's room. It has a lock on the inside." He added that last part quickly, seeing the look in her eyes. "I will not touch you. I swear on my wife's grave. I swear on her." He nodded at the sleeping baby. "I just need you to keep her alive." Nora looked at the small, pink face of the child in her arms. Grace. She had a name. She had a life that depended, for this one moment, on Nora's broken, cursed body. She thought of the market, the pointing fingers, the whispers, the polite cruelty of the banker's wife. She looked at the smirking, hateful face of Mrs. Gable, a woman who would use a baby's life as a negotiating chip. And then she looked at her room, the cold floor, the cracked mirror, the $50 she did not have. This was not a home. It was a cage. She made the decision. "All right," she said. Thomas's relief was so profound, he swayed on his feet. "But," Nora continued, her voice cutting, "we will settle accounts first." She turned her gaze to Mrs. Gable. "You want $50. "And I'll have it," the landlady sneered, "or I'll have the sheriff take your bed." Thomas stepped forward. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers. He pulled out a small, greasy leather pouch. He untied the thong and poured a small pile of coins and a few folded bills into his hand. He had been on his way to buy supplies, perhaps before his wife's labor had started. He counted out the money. Nora saw 2 $20 gold pieces, a 10, and then another 10. He did not give Mrs. Gable $50. He slapped $60 onto the small, 3-legged table. The pitcher and basin rattled. "That is for her rent," Thomas said, his voice flat. "And that is for the insult. You will take the money, and you will give me a receipt that says she is paid in full, and then you will get out of our way." The power in the room had shifted, as fast and as clean as a lightning strike. The money was on the table. The debt was gone. Mrs. Gable's only hold over Nora had been a financial one, and it was broken. The landlady's eyes went from the money to Thomas's face, to Nora's. She saw no path to victory. She snatched the bills and coins from the table. "You will be out of this room in 5 minutes." "We will be out of this room now," Nora said. She walked to the cot. The sleeping baby was still in one arm. With her free hand, she picked up her bundle of unsold bread. She did not look at the coin box. It was empty. She did not look at the cracked mirror or the mended quilt. There was nothing in this room she wanted. She walked to the door. The women in the hall scattered back, as if she were carrying a plague. Nora walked past Mrs. Gable without a word. She walked down the narrow, dark hallway, her head held high. Thomas was right behind her, his hand protectively near the back of her arm, not touching but shielding her. They walked down the stairs, their boots loud on the wooden steps. They walked through the small, dark foyer, past the parlor where the pious women of the town were now gathered, their faces pressed to the glass, their mouths open in shock. Thomas's wagon was tied up out front, a single, weary-looking horse in the traces. In the back was a rough pine box. Nora did not have to ask what was in it. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand strong and respectful at her elbow. He handed her the baby, who had not stirred, her small face peaceful in the twilight. He untied the horse, his movements quick and efficient. He climbed up beside her. He did not look back. He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, the wheels crunching on the dusty street. They rolled past the Gable boarding house. They rolled past the silent, staring faces. They rolled past the market, now dark and empty, the stalls like skeletons in the dusk. Nora held the baby close. She could feel the child's warmth, the steady beat of her small, salvaged heart. She was leaving a toxic, cruel world. She was heading into an unknown one, with a man whose rages were town gossip, to a ranch where a woman had just died. She should have been terrified. But as the wagon cleared the last buildings of Redemption Creek and the vast, open, starlit prairie opened up before them, Nora looked down at the new, warm purpose in her arms. She was not redeeming her past. She was not proving her value. She was just, for the first time in a very long time, doing the work that needed to be done. She was saving Grace, and in doing so, she was perhaps taking the first step towards saving herself. The ride was long, and it was silent. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon's axles, the steady, tired plodding of the horse, and the faint, sleeping breaths of the baby in Nora's arms. The pine box in the back of the wagon made its own small, shifting noises with every rut in the road, a grim counterpoint to the new life she held. Thomas Hayes did not speak. He kept his eyes fixed on the dark prairie, his shoulders rigid. He was a man holding himself together by a thread. And Nora knew, with the deep, weary wisdom of her own grief, that there was nothing she could say. Words were useless. There was only the work. They arrived at the ranch in the deep of night, under a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled salt. The moon was a sliver, offering just enough light to show a dark, low shape against the horizon, a house. Thomas pulled the horse to a halt. "We are here," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He sat for a moment, as if the energy required to get down from the wagon was too much to summon. Then he moved. A stiff, pained motion. He went to the back of the wagon first. He lifted the pine box. It was not large. Nora looked away, her heart aching with a shared, unspoken knowledge. He carried it to a small, new mound of earth she could just barely see near a stand of young, struggling trees. He was gone for only a minute. When he returned, his face was stone. "Let me take her," he said, holding his arms out for the baby. Nora passed Grace to him, the warmth of the child leaving her. He led her to the house. The door opened with a groan. The air inside was cold, and it smelled of disuse, stale wood smoke, and something sharper, the faint, sour scent of sickness. He lit a kerosene lamp on a table, the flame guttering and then rising, throwing huge, dancing shadows across a large main room. It was a good room, with a big stone fireplace, but the furniture was covered in dust, and a woman's shawl was still draped over a chair, as if she had just stepped out. "This way," he said, his voice hollow. He led her to a small, plain room at the back of the house, near the kitchen. It had a narrow bed, a small chest of drawers, and a hook on the door. It was the hired hand's room, as I said. He handed the baby back to Nora. Grace was stirring now, her small mouth beginning to root. "The lock is on the inside," and he said, his gaze fixed on the child, not on Nora. She usually wakes around 3, and then again at dawn." "I will manage," Nora said. He nodded, seemed to want to say more, then found he had no words. He turned and left, pulling the door almost closed, leaving her in the small, safe room. Nora sat on the bed. It was firm, the blankets clean but rough. She unbuttoned her dress, her movements efficient in the dark, and fed the baby. Grace drank strongly, her small hands clenched. When she was finished, Nora laid her on the bed, barricaded her with pillows, and, without undressing, fell into a sleep so deep it was like falling down a well. She woke to the cry. It was the full-throated, demanding cry of a healthy, hungry baby. The sun was not yet up, but the blackness of the sky was turning a faint, bruised gray. She fed Grace again, her body already adjusting to the new, life-giving rhythm. When the child was fed and changed, Nora wrapped her in the quilt from the bed and stepped out into the main room. Thomas was gone. She went to the front door and looked out. In the thin gray light of dawn, the ranch was revealed, and it was a portrait of despair. The house itself was solid, built of thick-cut timber with a foundation that looked square and true, but everything around it was falling apart. The front porch sagged. The fence that defined the yard was a ruin of broken slats and sagging wire. The barn's roof had a hole in it, and the chicken coop, visible near the back, looked as if one strong wind would turn it into a pile of rotten kindling. The land was good, she could see that. The soil was dark and rich, not the red clay of the town, but it was a place that had been run by a man, and a man alone, a man drowning in work and rage and, now, grief. She heard the sound of an axe, sharp, rhythmic, and filled with a kind of desperate, pounding energy. She followed the sound and saw him. Thomas was by a woodpile, his back to her. He was already soaked in sweat, though the morning was cold. He was attacking a large log, his movements powerful but ragged, without grace. He was doing the work of two men, and he was fueled by an exhaustion that was so deep it looked like a sickness. He was a man at the very end of his rope, and he was still trying to chop wood. Nora went back inside. The rhythm of her new life began. It was a life measured in 3-hour increments. Feed Grace, walk Grace until she slept, put her down, and then, in the silence, the work waited. The kitchen was the heart of the house, and it was the heart of the neglect. His wife, Sarah, had clearly been ill for a long time before the end. Pots were caked with old grease. The floor was sticky. A film of dust covered every surface. Thomas was a ghost in this new life. He would appear at midday, black with dirt and sweat, and swallow a hunk of stale bread and cheese without tasting it. He would appear again after dark, eat a cold supper from a can, and then fall onto a cot he had set up in the main room, not even using the bedroom he had shared with his wife. He was a machine of labor and grief. On the second day, Nora found herself with Grace asleep in a basket and 2 hours of silence ahead of a... She looked at the kitchen. The filth felt like an insult. It was an insult to the child, and it was an insult to the memory of the woman who had died here. She was not a servant, she was a wet nurse. But her hands, those large, capable hands, itched. She could not sit still in the middle of such chaos, to scrub, to clean, to impose order. It was a way to fight back against the darkness. It was a meditation. She found the lye soap. She found the brushes. She filled a bucket with hot water from the stove. She got down on her hands and knees, and she began to scrub the floor. She was working on the last, stubborn grease stain near the stove when he came in. He stopped dead in the doorway, his large frame blocking the light. He was carrying a broken harness. "What are you doing?" His voice was not angry. It was confused and edged with a deep, weary suspicion. "I am cleaning the floor," Nora said, not looking up. "I hired you," he said, his voice low, "to feed Grace. I did not hire you to be my scullery maid." He stumbled over the words, embarrassment and pride warring in him. "You are not. I am not. I am paying you. You do not have to work for your keep." The words, so different from Mrs. Gable's, were a shock. He was trying to offer her dignity. He was respecting the contract. He was respecting her. Nora stopped scrubbing. She sat back on her heels, her large, solid body unashamed. She looked up at him, her gaze as steady and clear as water. "The baby needs a clean place to live, Mr. Hayes," she said. "And I," she added, her voice dropping, "need a clean place to work. The floor was dirty. Now it is clean." She turned back to the stain. He stood there for a long, silent minute, watching her. He looked at the clean, damp wood, at the pot of water on the stove, at the woman who was bringing his dead house back to life, one scrub at a time. He said nothing. He turned, left the broken harness on the porch, and went back out to the barn. The work continued. The kitchen, over the next 2 days, was transformed. The pots were scoured until they shone. The single window was washed until the weak autumn light could actually enter. The stove was cleaned of its old soot. On the third day, Nora found his sack of flour. She found the yeast and, using the last of her own bread from town as a starter, she baked. When Thomas came in that evening, he stopped, not in the doorway, but in the center of the room. The house did not smell of sickness. It did not smell of dust. It smelled of warm, fresh bread. The table was set with 2 plates. A pot of stew, made from jerky and dried beans she had found, was simmering on the stove. The kitchen was clean and it was warm, and a lamp was lit. He sat down at the table, a man moving in a dream. Nora placed a bowl in front of him. She put the sleeping Grace in her basket on the floor nearby. She sat opposite him. They ate in silence. But it was a new silence. It was not the silence of rage and grief. It was the silence of a shared meal. The next morning, when Nora came out of her room for the 4 o'clock feeding, she found a tin mug of hot, black coffee waiting for her on the warm stones of the hearth. He was already gone, the sound of his hammering distant. But he had left it for her. It was the rarest, most meaningful form of thank you. They began to talk. It happened on the porch, in the evenings, after Grace was asleep. The silences were still long, but they were no longer empty. He spoke first. Sarah, she was not strong. He said it to the darkness, not to Nora. She was from the city. She hated this land. She hated the wind. She got sick, and I got angry. He told her about the doctor, the one in town who had refused to come out. He told her about the reverend who had preached about a husband's duty while Sarah was coughing up her lungs. He told her about the fight, the punch. He called her a weak vessel, Thomas whispered, his hands clenching. And I hit him. He had made himself an outcast, and when his wife went into labor, no one had come. He had delivered his own child, and in doing so, he had lost his wife. He had been alone, with a new dying baby, for 2 days. Nora listened, and when he was done, the silence stretched, and then she spoke. "My husband, Daniel," she said, her voice quiet. "He fell from a horse, drunk." She did not tell him about the violence. She did not tell him about the fear. She just told him the truth. He was not a bad man, not always, but he was a weak one. He saw the world through the bottom of a bottle. He died as he lived, careless. It was a small, brittle bridge of shared loss, 2 people, widowed not by gentle death, but by a kind of violent, careless failure. The next day, Nora's gaze fell on the chicken coop. It was a disaster. The few hens that remained were thin, listless, roosting on broken slats. She found the tool shed. It was as chaotic as the rest of the ranch, but the tools were there. She found a hammer, a saw, a box of old, bent nails. She found a stack of old lumber. She put Grace in her basket on a patch of clean grass in the sun, and she began to work. Her father had been a carpenter. He had taught her. Her hands, so often scorned for their size, were strong and capable. She tore out the rotted wood. She straightened the bent nails, one by one, with the flat of the hammer. She sawed new slats. Her movements were economical, precise. She was not just a woman who could bake. She was a woman who could build. She was nailing the last slat in place when 2 men rode up. They were rough-looking, hired hands by their gear. They stopped their horses, and their eyes went from the house to Thomas, who was walking over from the barn, to Nora. They looked at her, and their eyes were not respectful. They were the eyes of the market. They took in her size, her plain dress. One of them, a man with tobacco-stained teeth, grinned. "Mornin', Hayes," he said, not looking at Thomas. "Did not know you had company. That is a whole lot of woman for a place like this." The other one laughed, a wheezing sound. "Reckon she keeps you warm at night. Need a big woman for a cold night." Nora froze. The hammer was still heavy in her hand. Thomas did not get angry. The fire she had seen in the market, the rage she had seen in her room, it was gone. In its place was something far colder. He walked past Nora, and he stood between her and the men on their horses. He was not a big man, not as tall as the one with the stained teeth, but he seemed to take up all the air on the ranch. "I hired you to fix the north fence," Thomas said, his voice flat, conversational. "Your pay for the day is in the tin on the porch. Take it and get off my land." The men were shocked. The grinning man's face fell. "What we just got here, it was a joke. Hayes, just a joke." "Take your pay," Thomas repeated, his hand not moving toward his gun, just resting, relaxed, on his hip. "And get off my land, now." There was something in his voice. It was not the edge of a man about to break. It was the sound of a man who had already broken and had been put back together, harder. The men looked at each other. They saw the money in it was not worth this. They grumbled, but they turned their horses. "To hell with you, Hayes." The first one spat, but he spat it as he was riding away. Thomas stood, his back to her, until they were gone, until the sound of their horses had faded. He turned. He looked at Nora. He looked at the hammer in her hand. He looked at the repaired chicken coop. "They will not be back," he said. "I know," she said. He nodded at the coop. "That is good work." "It is," she said. He nodded again and walked back to the barn. The new law of the ranch had been established. The next morning, Nora went out to the coop. She had scattered fresh straw in the nesting boxes she had built. In the first box, there was nothing. In the second, there was a small, perfect brown egg. In the third, there was another. She gathered them in her apron. They were the first new life on this ranch, other than the one in the basket that she had seen. She went inside. She stoked the fire. She sliced the last of her bread. She found a clean skillet. When Thomas Hayes came in from the cold, he did not find a mug of coffee. He found the table set. He found a plate of scrambled eggs and bread toasted hot, and the smell of a home. He sat. She sat. They ate. It was the first real breakfast on the ranch in a very long time, and it was a symbol. The mending had begun. The eggs were a beginning. They were a small, tangible proof that life could and would return. But the ranch was a hard place, and it held its grief tightly. Behind the house, past the now mended chicken coop, was a plot of land that had once been a garden. Nora saw it on the first day she had felt brave enough to leave Grace sleeping in her basket on the porch, the air warm enough not to chill her. The garden was a testament to his wife's lost battle. It was strangled. Thick, thorny weeds, some as tall as Nora's waist, had woven a dense mat over what had once been neat rows. It was a choked, dead place. It looked, Nora thought, like the gossip in Redemption Creek, a tangled, vicious thing that had overgrown and killed the good soil beneath. She stood looking at it for a long time. She was a hired wet nurse. This was not her land, not her garden, not her life. Her contract was for her milk, not her labor. Thomas had made that clear. But the sight of the choked earth was an offense. It was a mirror of how she had felt for 6 weeks, her own mind overgrown with the weeds of grief and guilt. She went back to the tool shed. She found a heavy hoe, its blade rusted, and a pitchfork with a cracked handle. She began the work. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. She was a strong woman, her body built for it, but the weeds were defiant. They had deep, tangled roots. She hacked at them, her shoulders burning, the sun hot on her black dress. She pulled them up by the handful, the thorns tearing at her thick-skinned palms. With every weed she tore from the earth, it felt like she was tearing out a piece of the ugliness she had lived with. Mrs. Gable's sneer, the banker's wife's cold eyes, her own husband's heavy hand. She hacked and pulled and raked, the pile of dead growth growing taller than she was. She was soaked in sweat, her breath coming in gasps. When he found her, he had ridden in from the north fence line, and he sat his horse, silent, watching her. She did not stop. She was on her knees, pulling a particularly stubborn thistle. "Nora," he said. His voice was quiet. "It is good soil," she said, her voice a pant. She did not look up, ashamed to let it go to waste. He swung down from the horse. He did not tell her to stop. He did not remind her of her contract. He simply took the pitchfork from where she had leaned it and began to work beside her, lifting the heavy piles of uprooted weeds and carrying them to a clear spot for a bonfire. They did not speak. They worked. For 2 hours, there was only the sound of the hoe scraping the earth, the rustle of the dead weeds, and their shared, heavy breathing. They cleared the entire plot. When they were done, they were both filthy, streaked with dirt and sweat. The garden plot was a square of dark, rich, open earth. It was raw and scarred, but it was ready. "In the kitchen," he said, his voice rough from the dust. "In the pantry, there is a tin box. Sarah, she bought seeds. For this spring, she never—" "I will find them," Nora said. She found the box. It was full of small paper packets, the names written in a delicate, looping hand: beans, squash, corn, tomatoes. She laid them out on the clean kitchen table like a promise. She planted them the next day, while he was mending the barn roof. The work was different now. It was not tearing out, it was putting in. She pressed the seeds into the fresh-turned earth, her large hands gentle. She was not just planting a garden, she was planting a future. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue for a week, was turning. By that evening, the air had a new, heavy stillness, and the horizon was a bruised, yellowish gray. "Storm's coming," Thomas said on the porch. He was looking at the clouds, his brow tight. "A bad one, I think." It hit just after midnight. Nora was jerked awake not by Grace, but by a sound so loud it shook the house. It was a crack of thunder that sounded like the sky splitting in two, followed immediately by a roar. It was not the wind, it was rain, a solid, driving, horizontal wall of water. Grace, startled by the noise, let out a wail. Nora lit her lamp, her hands trembling, the small flame jumping in the drafts. She soothed the baby, her voice a low murmur against the howl of the storm. "Thomas." His voice was a shout, barely audible over the rain. He was pounding on her door. "Nora, are you all right? Is the baby?" "We are fine," she shouted back. "The room is dry." "Stay there," he called, but he sounded frantic. She heard the front door slam open, and she heard him curse, a long, bitter sound. She could not just sit there. She wrapped Grace tightly in the quilt and opened her door. The main room was chaos. The wind had ripped the front door from his hand, and it was slamming back and forth on its hinges. Rain was driving into the room, soaking the floor. But that was not the problem. The problem was the roof. In the center of the room, a steady, thick stream of water was pouring down, as if a tap had been opened. It was landing on the table, on the floor, on the very spot where Grace's basket usually sat. Thomas was fighting the door, his full weight against it, finally managing to slam it shut and drop the heavy bar. He was already soaked to the skin. He turned, his face grim in the lamplight. "The roof, that spot I mended. I did not mend it well enough." We have to catch it," Nora said, her mind working. She was not a woman who panicked. She saw the problem. She looked for the fix. The big stew pot in the kitchen. He grabbed the pot, and she grabbed a smaller one. They placed them under the leak. The sound of the water changed from a splash to a hollow, metallic plink. "Plink! Plink!" "It will not hold," he said, looking at the ceiling. "The plaster is coming loose." "The barn," she said, her heart sinking. "The hole. What about the stock?" His face went gray. "The new calf." He grabbed a heavy oilskin coat from a hook. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me." "Thomas, you cannot," she said. "That is not wind. It is a river. You will be swept away." "I have to," he said, his face a mask of stubbornness. I cannot lose anything else." He was out the door before she could argue, a lantern in his hand, swallowed instantly by the black, roaring, wet night. Nora stood in the center of the room, holding the baby, and she was terrified, not of the storm, but for him. She did not know how long she waited, an hour, maybe 2. The pots filled, and she emptied them, a frantic, repetitive journey. Grace cried, and Nora fed her body on autopilot, her ears strained, listening for a sound that was not the wind. The door burst open. He was not there. And then he was staggering in, falling to his knees. He was covered in mud, a bleeding gash on his forehead and in his arms. He was carrying a half-drowned, newborn calf, its legs like sticks. "Thomas, it is all right," he panted, pushing wet hair from his eyes, smearing the blood. I got him. The mother is... She's tied in the shed. But the roof..." He did not have to finish. He laid the calf on a pile of sacks by the hearth, where it shivered and steamed. He was shaking, not just with cold, but with a deep, bone-rattling exhaustion. "You are hurt," Nora said. "It is nothing." He went to the leak. The plink was becoming a steady drumming. "It is worse. It is spreading." He looked at Nora, and in that moment, they were not a boss and a wet nurse. They were two people in a cabin, and the wild was trying to get in. "The old table," he said. "The one in Sarah's room. It is heavy. We can move it. Get on top, patch it from the inside." He led the way into the dark, cold bedroom he never used. It smelled of lavender and dust. He did not light a lamp. He did not need to. He knew where the table was. He heaved, and she put Grace in her basket, and she heaved, and together they half-dragged, half-carried a heavy oak table into the main room. "It is not tall enough," she said. "Get on the table," he commanded. "I will lift you." She climbed onto the table. Her heavy dress soaked in an instant from the water on its surface. She looked up. The hole was just above her, a dark, weeping gash. "I cannot reach it," she said. "My tools, hammer, nails, the oilskin I was cutting." He ran, grabbed them from a chest. He climbed onto the table with her. The small, slick surface was crowded. "Hold the lantern," he said. She held it high. He was stretching, his arm at full length, trying to hammer a piece of oilskin over the gash. The water poured over him, over his hands, over the hammer. "It is too high," he growled. I cannot get the angle." "Lift me," Nora said. "What?" "Lift me." She was a big woman. She knew what she was asking. "I am taller, my arms are longer. Lift me." He stared at her for a half-second, his eyes wide in the lantern light. He saw she was serious. He was a strong man, but... "All right," he grunted. "Put your foot here, on my thigh, hold my shoulder, go." He braced himself. Nora, holding the hammer and the oilskin, put her boot on his leg, her hand on his shoulder, and he lifted. He did not just lift her. He raised her up, his body trembling with the strain, his arms locking around her waist to keep her steady. She was eye level with the leak. The cold water ran down her arms, into her face. Now she shouted over the storm. She hammered. She did not hammer like a woman. She hammered like a carpenter. 4, 5, 6 clean, hard blows, the nails sinking deep into the wet wood, pinning the oilskin, sealing the leak. The roar of the water pouring in stopped. It was replaced by a heavy, wet drumming on the roof, but it was on the roof, not in the room. "It is done," she panted. I have got you," he said. His voice was strained, right by her ear. She realized, in that moment, that she was pressed entirely against him. His arms were a steel band around her waist, her body held aloft by his strength. She was soaked. He was soaked. The heat from his body was a shock, steaming through their wet clothes. She could feel the hard, steady thumping of his heart against her back. She had not been held by a man in... She could not remember. Not like this. Not with strength that was not violent. Not with a purpose that was to help. Not to harm. You can put me down, Thomas," she said, her voice suddenly, shockingly, unsteady. He lowered her, his movements careful. Her feet found the table. His arms did not leave her waist for a moment, not until she was stable. They stood, face to face, on the small, wet table, in the dim, chaotic room. The lantern light shone on his face, on the blood on his forehead, on the exhaustion in his eyes, and on something else. He was looking at her, not at her size, not at her mourning dress. He was looking at her, at the woman who had hammered in the dark, in the storm, at the top of a table. The moment stretched. There was only the sound of the rain, the wind, and their breathing. A small, hiccuping cry broke the spell. "Grace." They both moved at once, a clumsy, fast scramble off the table. Nora went to the baby, her heart hammering harder than the rain. She picked her up, her hands shaking. Thomas just stood there, staring at the patch on the ceiling. "That," he said, his voice a low rasp, That held. Yes, Nora said, her back to him, her face buried in Grace's blanket. It did. The next day, the world was washed clean, the air was sharp and cold, the storm was gone. Nora's dress was still damp. Grace had spit up a large, milky mess, all over the front of it. Nora took the dress off in her room and put on her only other one, an older, more faded black. She took the soiled dress and Grace's swaddling to the pump by the porch to wash them. The pump was stiff. She was struggling, one-handed, to work the handle and hold the clothes. He came up behind her, his voice quiet. "Let me." He took the handle. His hand, large and calloused, brushed hers. It was nothing, a scrape of skin on skin. It was everything. It was a jolt, as sharp and as sudden as the milk letdown. It was a fire that leaped from his skin to hers. She snatched her hand back as if she had been burned. He froze, the handle halfway down. He looked at her, his eyes dark, his expression unreadable. Nora's face was on fire. She was ashamed. She was a widow. She was a hired nurse. She was a large, plain woman. And she had just felt that. She dropped her eyes, her hand going to the high collar of her dress. "Thank you," she mumbled. I can manage." He did not move, just watched her. "Nora," he said. "Please," she whispered. "Do not." He let go of the handle. He stepped back. "I will be in the barn," he said, and he left. That night, on the porch, the silence was back, but it was not the comfortable silence of shared work. It was a new, tight, fragile silence. He broke it. "I'm sorry, Mia," he said. Nora's heart leaped. "For what?" "At the pump, I did not mean to startle you." "You did not," she lied, her voice small. He let the lie sit for a moment, then he spoke to the darkness, his voice raw. "I look at her, at Grace, and I see Sarah, and I see all the ways I failed her. I was so angry. Nora, at the drought, at the reverend, at the doctor, at this whole damned, hard country. I was angry for a year, and my anger, it drove everyone away. When we needed help, there was no one left to call." His voice broke. "I hit a man of God, and for that, my wife died alone, and my baby almost. That is a long shadow to live under." Nora sat, her hands clenched in her lap. She remembered the market, the rage in his eyes, the rage she had stopped. "My husband, Daniel," she said, her own voice so low he had to lean in to hear her. "He did not just fall from a horse." She had never told anyone, not Martha, not the preacher. "He was a man of strong drink and a heavy hand." She said it flat, a fact. The night he died, he was not just drunk, he was angry, because I had told him. "I was with child." Thomas stopped breathing. "He did not want it," Nora continued, her voice a monotone, as if speaking of a stranger. He hit me in the stomach. He said he would beat it out of me. I fell. I hit my head on the stove." She touched a place at her temple, hidden by her hair. "When I woke up, he was gone. He had taken the horse. He was dead before morning." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "My baby, my son, he was born 6 weeks ago, too early. He was so small. The doctor said it was the fall. My curse." The silence on the porch was absolute. It was the sound of two people at the bottom of a well, staring up at the same, small, distant star. Thomas finally let out a breath. He did not move. He did not touch her. "We are," he said, his voice thick with a new, terrible understanding. "A pair. Are we not a man who killed his wife with his rage, and a woman who was—" "We are survivors, Thomas," she said, her voice hard. "You and me, and that baby in there." Grace was, indeed, thriving. She was not the gray, skeletal thing from the market. She was a baby. She was gaining weight. Her cheeks were round and pink. Her cries were not thready and weak. They were loud, demanding, and full of life. Nora's love for her was a physical ache. It was a fierce, protective, terrifying thing. She would look at Grace, and her heart would swell so much she thought it would break. This was her baby. And then she would remember. She was a hired hand, hired for the milk in her breasts. Her milk was plentiful. Grace was growing. But what would happen when Grace was weaned? When she could take cow's milk? What would happen to Nora then? Her position, her safety, her newfound purpose, it was temporary. She was just the wet nurse. The thought was a cold stone in her gut. The outside world, which they had held at bay for 3 weeks, finally arrived in the form of the mail rider. He was a thin, weasel-faced man named Silas, who rode the route once a week. He did not just deliver mail, he delivered gossip. He was the living newspaper of the county. He rode up, his horse stopping, and his eyes took in everything. He saw the clean porch. He saw the smoke from the chimney. He saw the new, healthy baby that Nora was holding on her hip. And he saw her, Nora, not in a widow's weeds, but in her other, faded, working dress, her face clean, her hair tidy. "Afternoon, Miss Nora," he said, his voice slick, his eyes devouring the domestic scene. "Mr. Hayes." Thomas came out, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was like stone. "Silas," he said. "A lot of changes," Silas said, his gaze flicking between them. "Town's been wondering about you and the baby." "The baby is fine," Thomas said. His voice was flat. "As you can see." That I can," Silas said, his grin not reaching his eyes. And the widow, she is fine, too, I see." The insinuation was as thick and as foul as swamp mud. Thomas did not get angry. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked down the porch steps until he was standing at Silas's knee. "Silas," he said, his voice very, very quiet, "you will deliver the mail, and then you will leave." "Now, Hayes, I was just—" "And you will tell the town," Thomas continued, as if he had not spoken, "that Miss Nora is under my roof and under my protection. She is the woman who is saving my daughter's life, and any man or woman who speaks a word against her, speaks it against me. You will not be welcome on this land. You will not be served in this home. You will not speak her name." The new law of the ranch. He was not just stating it for the hired hands, he was stating it for the whole damned listening world. Silas's grin evaporated. He saw the man who had punched the Reverend. He handed over a small bundle of letters, his hand shaking. "No offense meant, Hayes," he mumbled. "None taken," Thomas said, "unless it is given again." Silas kicked his horse, hard, and was gone in a cloud of dust. Thomas stood, watching him go. Nora was on the porch, her heart pounding. She had never, in her life, had a man stand up for her, not her father, not her husband. She was a large woman, a strong woman, and everyone had always assumed she could take care of herself. He had protected her. He had called her Miss Nora. He had called her the woman who was saving his daughter. She was so grateful. Her knees were weak, and she was terrified. Because a man's protection was a fickle thing, and her purpose here, the purpose he had defended, was finite. It was measured in ounces of milk. She looked at him, his back still to her, a strong, solitary figure standing against the world. She knew, with a sudden, cold certainty, that the storm was not over. The mail rider was a scouting party. The town of Redemption Creek had not forgotten them. It had just been biding its time. The garden was planted, the roof was patched, but the walls of their small, salvaged world were about to be tested. Silas, the mail rider, had been the first gust, the warning. For a week, the ranch was still, held in a bubble of tents, shared peace, the garden, which had been rows of dark, turned earth, now showed the first, faint, courageous wisps of green. Life was pushing up. Then, on a Tuesday, the air changed. Thomas had been restless all morning. The north fence, the one he had been mending for a week, was his excuse. "It's the last section," he said, standing at the door, his hat in his hand. "The one by the creek bed. I will be gone." Most of the day, all day. Nora, who was churning a small pat of butter, nodded. Grace was on a blanket on the floor, her small, round face tracking a beam of dust motes in the sunlight. "We will be fine." He hesitated. He had not left her alone, not for this long, since the day Silas had come. "Lock the door," he said. "The new bar, the one I will lock the bar," she said, her voice gentle. "Go. The fences need mending." He looked at her, then at Grace. He nodded, a short, sharp motion, and he was gone. She heard the sound of his horse's hooves fade, heading north. She went to the door. She slid the new, heavy wooden bar he had carved into place. The thud was a solid, reassuring sound. She was alone, truly alone. The late morning passed in a quiet, domestic rhythm. She fed Grace. She laid her in her basket for her nap. She took the small pot of beans she had soaked and put them on the back of the stove to simmer. The house was clean, it was warm, and it was peaceful. She went out to the new garden, her hands itching to pull the few small, impudent weeds that had dared to show themselves. She was on her knees, the warm sun on her back, her hands in the rich, dark soil, when she heard the carriage. It was not a wagon. It was a carriage, a black, high-sided town buggy, the kind that was only ever used for visiting or for funerals. It was moving too fast for the rough road. Nora's heart did not sink. It stopped. It was a cold, hard stone in her chest. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. Her hands were covered in dirt. She felt, suddenly, wild, uncivilized, and she was glad of it. The buggy pulled up, the horse lathered, and the delegation disembarked. It was, as she had known it would be, Mrs. Gable, her landlady, her creditor, her tormentor. She was dressed in her Sunday black, her face pinched into a mask of moral satisfaction. With her was the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Thorne, a small, bird-like woman whose eyes held no charity, and, for weight, for social importance, they had brought the banker's wife, Mrs. Davies, the one who had bought Nora's bread with such cold disdain. It was a tribunal, a traveling court of public opinion, and they had come to pass sentence. Nora did not go to them. She stood, a large, solid figure, at the edge of her garden, and she made them cross the yard to her. "Nora, Mrs.," Gable said, her voice sharp, as if Nora were a disobedient dog. "We are here. You will unbar the door." "Good afternoon, ladies," Nora said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. "Thomas is not here. He is away. On business." "We are not here to see Mr. Hayes," Mrs. Thorne, the Reverend's wife, chirped. "We are here to see you, child. We are here for your soul." "My soul is my own, Mrs. Thorne," Nora said, her hands clasping in front of her. "That, Mrs., Gable sneered, "is precisely the problem. You've been out here, alone, for almost 4 weeks, living in this house, with that man." "A man," Mrs. Davies added, her voice smooth and cold, "who has a known, violent temper, a man who struck the Reverend. We are here for your safety, Nora, and for the town's." "The town's?" Nora asked. "You are a stain," Mrs. Gable said, the words coming fast, her venom finding its release. "A stain on the good name of Redemption Creek, living in sin, a widow, barely 6 weeks, shacking up with a known sinner. You are a whore, Nora, a disguised, oversized whore, and we will not have it." The word they had whispered in the boarding house, the word they had thought at the market, it was out. It hung in the clean, sun-washed air, an obscene, ugly thing. Nora took a step back. It was a physical blow. "We are here, Mrs. Thorne said, her small eyes bright. "To bring you back to civilization, back to the church. You will come with us. You will repent, and you will be cleansed. You will come back to the boarding house." "Mrs.," Gable snapped, "the practical matter at hand. You will work off your debt, the rest of your debt." "And the child?" Nora asked, her voice a whisper. "The child, Mrs.," Davies said, as if noticing the basket on the porch for the first time. "The child is his. It is his problem. Our concern is for your immortal soul and our town's reputation." They were going to take her. They were going to drag her back to that room, to that life. And they were going to leave Grace. "No," Nora said. "It is not a request. Nora." "Mrs.," Gable said, taking a step toward her, "we have 2 good men in town who will ride out and fetch you if you are not reasonable." "No," Nora said again, louder. Her fear was evaporating, replaced by a cold, hard rage that was so pure it was almost calming. You will not take me, and you will not leave her. You will get back in your buggy, and you will leave this ranch." "Why, you ungrateful..." "Mrs.," Gable was sputtering, her face red. It was then that they heard the horses. Nora's heart leaped. Thomas, he was back. But it was not Thomas. It was 2 riders, lurching, unsteady in the saddle. Their hats were pushed back. Their faces were flushed. They were drunk. It was Jed and Pike, the 2 men he had fired. They reined in their horses, their eyes wide, taking in the bizarre female-only scene, the 3 town ladies in their Sunday best, the large woman in the dirt-stained apron. "Well, now, Pike," Jed said, his voice a low drawl, his tobacco-stained teeth showing in a wide grin. "Look here, it seems we have interrupted the Ladies' Aid Society meeting." The 3 women turned, horrified, to be seen here with these men. How dare you, Mrs., Davies stammered, her social standing a useless shield against this. "Oh, we dare, ma'am," Pike wheezed, laughing. He dismounted, his boots unsteady. Jed followed, a bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. We just come back to see old Hayes." "He's not here," Nora said, her voice like a blade. Jed's eyes snapped to her. His grin widened, and it was a terrible, ugly thing. "Well, now, ain't that just convenient?" He swaggered forward. "See, we've been thinking. Old Hayes. He fired us. For nothing. For just talking to his big friend." He was in front of Nora now. He was close. He smelled of sweat and whiskey and a deep, sour malice. The 3 women from town were frozen, a chorus of black-clad terror. "You need to leave," Nora said. "Grace." She had to get to Grace. "Oh, we will," Jed said. He looked over her shoulder at the basket on the porch. "But first, we was wondering, what's a woman like you do to make a man like Hayes so protective?" He reached out. Nora was not a small woman, but he was fast. His hand, greasy and hard, closed around her upper arm. The contact was a violation. It was a brand. It was her husband's hand. It was every man who had ever looked at her with scorn, or with lust, or with hate. "Get your hand off me," she hissed, her body tensing. "Feisty," Jed laughed, his grip tightening, his knuckles digging in. "I like 'em feisty, even the big ones. Maybe especially the big ones." "Sir, Mrs.," Thorne shrieked. This is an outrage." You just stay put, little birdie," Pike said, waving his bottle at her. Your turn's comin'." Jed pulled Nora hard a step toward him. "Where is he, woman? Where is that? The sound was not a sound. It was a crack. It was the sound of the world being split in 2, a rifle shot. It was so loud, it seemed to suck the air from the yard. A white gash appeared on the porch railing, not 3 inches from Jed's head. The splintered wood flew. Jed froze. His hand was still on Nora's arm, but his body was rigid, his eyes wide with a sudden, sober terror. He let go of her as if her skin had turned to hot iron. Silence. Dead, absolute silence. And in that silence, the sound of a single horse, walking, not running, measured and calm. Thomas. He was 50 yards away, on his horse, not even breathing hard. The rifle, a big Winchester, was resting in the crook of his arm, as if it had grown there. He was not aiming it. He did not need to. He rode slowly into the center of the yard, the horse's hooves making small, puffing sounds in the dust. He stopped. His eyes were not on the 3 women, who were huddled by their buggy like frightened hens. His eyes were not on Pike, who had his hands raised in the air. His eyes were on Jed. Touching her, Thomas said, his voice a quiet, conversational calm that was 1,000 times more terrifying than any shout. Is touching me. He looked at the splintered porch rail. I told you to get off my land. I will not tell you again. He raised the rifle, just an inch, and the snick of him levering a new round into the chamber was the loudest sound in the world. Go, he said. Jed and Pike did not need to be told a 3rd time. They were scrambling, falling over each other, to get to their horses. Pike dropped his bottle, the whiskey spilling into the dust. They threw themselves into their saddles, kicked their horses into a frantic, panicked gallop, and fled. Thomas watched them go. He watched until they were small, disappearing dots. The dust began to settle. Then, his gaze, cold as a winter river, moved to the 3 women. They were trapped. Their buggy was their only escape, and he was between them and the road. Mrs. Sis, Gable found her voice, or a weak, trembling version of it. Mr. Hayes, we were concerned. For Nora. Thomas looked at them. He looked at their fine black dresses. He looked at their frightened, hypocritical faces. He said nothing. He just sat on his horse, the rifle resting on his thigh, a silent, unmovable judge. He had heard them. He had been on the ridge. He had heard the word whore. He turned his head, just slightly. He looked at their buggy. He looked at the road. He did not have to say the word again. They understood. They were a tangle of black skirts, scrambling, fighting each other to get into the buggy. Misses. Davies fell and misses. Gable pulled her in, her face a mask of white terror. Misses. Thorne grabbed the reins, her hands shaking, and she whipped the poor horse, turning the buggy in a frantic, undignified circle, its wheels throwing dirt. They fled just as the men had. The ranch was silent. The only sound was a new one, a thin, terrified wail. Grace. She was awake. Thomas sat on his horse, his whole body rigid. Nora was on the porch, her back pressed against the wall, her legs shaking so hard she could not stand. She was staring at him, her eyes huge, tears she had not known she was crying streaming down her face, leaving clean tracks in the dust of the garden. He finally, slowly dismounted. He let the rifle drop, the metal thud hitting the dirt. He did not run. He walked, his boots heavy, each step a conscious, deliberate act. He walked up the 3 steps to the porch. He stopped, a foot in front of her. He was breathing hard, the adrenaline draining, leaving him pale. He looked at her torn sleeve where Jed had grabbed her, at her tear-streaked face. He did not speak. He just opened his arms. It was not a question. It was a harbor. Nora fell. She did not step. She fell forward, all her strength, all her terror, all her rage, collapsing in one single, shuddering motion. She fell into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her face burying itself in the rough, sweat-soaked cotton of his shirt. Her large, strong body was shaking, racked with sobs that tore from her chest. His arms came around her, crushing her to him. His arms were steel, a cage, a fortress. He wrapped her up, his own face buried in her hair, his hat gone, his entire body trembling with the aftershock of the violence he had been ready to commit. He touched me. She wept into his chest, the words broken. His hands, Shh, Thomas growled, his voice a low, pained sound. Shh, he will not ever again. I have got you. I am here. I have got you. A small, wailing cry came from the basket. He did not let her go. He just shifted, his arms still locked around her, and he bent, one-handed, and scooped the basket, the baby, into the embrace. He held them both, the woman and the child, crushed against his chest, as if he could, by force of will, absorb them both into his own body and keep them safe. They stood there, a broken, tangled, shaking mass of 3 people in the middle of the quiet, sunlit yard. Finally, the sobs quieted. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs wiping the grit and tears from her cheeks. His gaze was raw, stripped, all the barriers gone. I was on the ridge, he said, his voice thick. I saw the buggy. I thought... Then I saw their horses. He rested his forehead against hers. I rode. Nora, I have never ridden like that. When I saw his hand on you, his voice broke. You came, she whispered. I will always come, and he said, his voice fierce. He pulled back, his hands gripping her shoulders. I stood on that ridge. I heard what she called you. Nora's eyes closed. Shame, hot and sharp, washed over her. No, he said, his grip tightening. No, you look at me. She opened her eyes. I thought, he said, the words torn from him, that I needed a nurse. I thought I was paying for milk. I am a fool. This house, this land. I was dead. Nora, I was a dead man, walking, and you came. He shook his head, a short, harsh laugh. I need you, not your milk, not your bread. I need you, Nora, like I need air. I need you safe. I cannot go back to that dark. I will not. This was it, the confession, the truth. It was more terrifying than the rifle. She looked at him, at this man of rage and grief and a loyalty so fierce it was a weapon. She saw her own fear, her own temporary status, and she saw it for what it was, a weed, a thing to be pulled. I love you, she said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the silence with the force of the rifle shot. His eyes closed. A single, pained breath escaped him. He opened them. He looked at her as if he was seeing the sun for the first time. Nora, he breathed, the name a prayer. And he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of aftermath, of survival. It was desperate, and it was deep, and it was a promise. It was the salt of her tears, and the grit of the prairie, and the taste of a life that had been snatched, twice, from the edge of death. He held her and the baby, and he kissed her, and she held him back, her large, strong arms locked around him, and in that moment, in the dust of the yard, under the high, unforgiving sun, they were not 2 broken people. They were one. The kiss ended, but he did not let her go. He held her, his arms locked, his forehead pressed against hers. The world, which had been reduced to the sound of a rifle and the beat of his heart, came rushing back in. The wail of the baby in the basket, the thrum of his own pulse in his ears, the sting of the sun on his face. They will come back, he said, his voice a low, rough rasp against her skin. I know, she whispered. She was still shaking, her arms locked around his neck, her feet unsteady on the porch. Not just them, he said, pulling back just enough to look at her, his hands still gripping her, his gaze frantic. The men, the women, Mrs. Gable, they will not let this rest. They will not let you rest. He saw the fear in her eyes, the shame and the exhaustion, and he saw the future. He saw them coming back, not with buggies, but with the law, with the sheriff, with some manufactured claim. I can shoot at hired men, Nora," he said, his voice thick with a new kind of desperation. "I can scare old women, but I cannot fight the town, not like this." He was right. The law, the ordinance, the full, self-righteous weight of Redemption Creek, they had been protected by isolation, but the isolation was broken. The world knew she was here. "They will invent a law," he said, as if reading her mind. "They will find a way to take you. They will call you a vagrant. They will call you what she called you, and they will take you from me, and they will take you from Grace." That was the heart of it, the child. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice small, the strength that had held her up now gone. "You marry me," he said. The words were not a plea. They were not romantic. They were a raw, urgent, tactical necessity. She stared at him, her tear-streaked face stunned. "What?" "Marry me," he said, his grip tightening, pulling her closer. "Now, tomorrow, at dawn, we will ride in, we will find the justice. They cannot touch a married woman. They cannot touch my wife." The word, it hung between them, as strange and as foreign as the word whore. She looked at him, at the blood on his forehead, which he had forgotten, at the fierce, desperate, protective loyalty in his eyes. He was not her husband. He was not Daniel, with his easy charms and his secret, violent hands. This man was rage, and he was grief, and he was hard, good soil, and he was offering her his name, not as a gift, but as a shield, as a fortress. She was afraid. She was terrified. She was a widow of 2 months. She was a hired wet nurse. She was a large, plain woman who had, for the first of her life, been chosen. She looked past him, at the basket, at the small, wailing face of the child she had saved, her child. "Yes," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was as firm as the patch on the roof. "Yes." His eyes closed. The breath he had been holding left him in a long, shuddering sigh. He did not kiss her again. He just pulled her, and the baby's basket, into the house, and he barred the door. The rest of the day was a dream. They moved like two people who had survived a shipwreck, stunned, their actions automatic, their voices hushed. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary ache and a new, humming, terrifying silence. He cleaned the gash on his head. She fed Grace, and he went out, not to the fence line, but to the barn, and she heard the sound of him currying the horse, his movements slow, methodical. He was not fixing a fence. He was preparing for a journey. She made supper, the beans, the last of the bread. They ate at the clean kitchen table, Grace asleep in her basket by their feet. The silence was deafening. They were two strangers who had confessed everything, who had seen the bottom of each other's souls, and who had agreed, in the light of day, to be chained together for life. Was it a mistake? She looked at his hands. They were on the table. They were clean, the nails broken, the knuckles scarred. They were the hands that had lifted her in the storm. They were the hands that had been gentle on her face. They were the hands that had just held a rifle, ready to kill for her. He looked up, and he caught her watching him. His eyes were dark, his face raw from the shave he had given himself. He looked younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. "Nora," he said, his voice low, Are you sure?" She looked at him, at this man who had been defined by his anger, and she saw, for the first time, the deep, profound fear beneath it. He was not afraid of the town. He was afraid of this. He was afraid she would say no. "I'm sure," she said. Her voice did not tremble. "Are you?" He did not answer. He just stood up, pushed his chair back, and walked out onto the porch, into the cool, purple twilight. She followed him. She had to. He was standing at the rail, his back to her, looking out at the vast, empty prairie. The crickets were starting their song. The air was cool and smelled of the damp earth from the garden. "Sarah," he said, his voice so quiet she barely heard him. She hated it here. She hated the silence. She hated me. She was a fine, delicate thing, like a teacup. And I am a rock. I broke her. "You do not know that," Nora said, standing beside him, her hands gripping the rail. "Yes, I do," he said, turning to her. "I know, and you are not delicate, Nora. You are as strong as this land. You are like the stone foundation of this house, and I am afraid. I will break you, too." "I am not a teacup," Nora said, her voice fierce, "and I am not stone. I am a woman who has been broken, and so are you. A man who has been broken. That is all. We are just pieces." He looked at her strong, plain face in the twilight, at her large, capable body. "I do not want to be alone anymore. Thomas," she whispered, the last, final, deepest truth. I am so tired of being alone." He stepped in front of her. He put his hands on her arms, not in a grip, but in a holding. "I am here," he said. He kissed her. It was not the kiss of the afternoon, the desperate, life-saving kiss. This was different. It was slow. It was a question. It was a promise. His lips were soft, hesitant. He was asking. And she answered. She leaned into him, her arms coming up, not to cling, but to hold. She put her hands on his shoulders, and she kissed him back. It was a kiss of profound and quiet discovery. It was the first time in her life she had been kissed with respect, with a kind of awe. His hand moved from her arm to her back, to her hair, his fingers gentle. She was not a big woman. She was not a whore. She was not the widow. She was Nora. And he held her. He did not try for more. He just held her. He pulled her against his chest, and she let her head rest on his shoulder, and his chin rested on the top of her head. They stood, two large, solid, broken people, and they fit. The crickets sang, the prairie was quiet, and for the first time, the house behind them felt like a home. It was a vow taken on a dark porch, with no one but the stars as witness. The dawn was gray, and it was cold. They moved in the dark, the lantern throwing shadows. Thomas hitched the horse to the wagon, the same horse. Nora came out, dressed in her only other dress, the one she had been married in, the first time. It was a faded, dark wool, mended at the elbows. She held Grace, who was bundled so tightly in the mended quilt that only her small, pink, sleeping face was visible. He helped her up. His hand was strong at her elbow. He placed Grace's basket at her feet, and he tucked an old buffalo robe around her legs. He climbed up beside her. He did not have his rifle. He had his good hat, the one he had not worn. He snapped the reins. The wagon lurched. They rode in silence as the sun came up, painting the eastern sky in bands of pale pink and desperate, cold yellow. They were a family, going to their own execution, or their own salvation. Redemption Creek was awake. It was not Saturday, but the street was full, not full, but waiting. Silas had done his work. Mrs. Gable had done hers. They were gathered, in small, silent, judgmental clumps outside the dry goods store, outside the saloon. They were waiting to see. Thomas drove the wagon straight down the middle of the street. He did not slow down. He did not look left or right. His face was carved from stone. He pulled up in front of the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a large man named Brody, was waiting. He was on the boardwalk, his star pinned to a vest that was straining. He looked tired, and he looked deeply, deeply uncomfortable. "Hayes," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Ma'am." "Sheriff," Thomas said. He did not get down. "There has been a complaint," Brody said, his eyes on his own boots. "A formal complaint from Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Thorne and several other ladies of the town." Thomas said nothing. He just waited. It is about an ordinance," the sheriff said, his face flushing a dull red. Section 4, on unlawful cohabitation and public morals." The trap, it was sprung. You cannot live as you are, Hayes," the sheriff said, finally looking up, his eyes hard. It is an offense. It is a scandal, and I am bound by the law." The crowd was murmuring now, the whispers growing, satisfied. You have two choices," Brody said. "You will either cease or you will marry. You will do it today, now, or I will be forced to place you both under arrest, Miss Nora, for vagrancy, and you, Hayes, for contributing to a moral nuisance." Mrs. Gable in the crowd was smirking. It was a small, tight, victorious smile. Thomas's hand, resting on his thigh, clenched. The rage, the old, familiar fire, was building in his eyes. He opened his mouth. No. The voice was Nora's. She stood up in the wagon. She was holding Grace. She was a large, solid woman, in a faded black dress, her hair pulled back, and she looked, in that moment, like a queen. She looked at the sheriff, and then her gaze moved, past him, to the crowd. She found Mrs. Gable's face. You think you are forcing me," Nora said, her voice not a shout but clear, carrying in the sudden, shocked silence. You think you are trapping us." She gave a small, short laugh. It was not a bitter laugh. It was a free one. "You have no power here," she said. "You have not had power for a long time." She turned, her back to the town, and she looked down at Thomas, who was staring up at her, his face a mask of stunned awe. She held out her free hand to him. "I choose this man," she said, her voice ringing. "I choose this life. I choose him." She did not wait for him to help her. She stepped down, from the wheel to the ground, her body solid, her movements sure. She stood in the dust in front of him, and she held the baby. The town was silent. Mrs. Gable's smirk was gone, her mouth a small, open O of shock. The sheriff let out a long, slow breath. He almost smiled. "Well," he said, "the justice, his office is just 2 doors down. I believe he is in..." The wedding was a blur. The justice of the peace was a small, dusty man who smelled of old paper and tobacco. His office was full of books that were falling apart. He read the words, his voice a dry monotone. There had to be witnesses. Martha was there. She had appeared, as if from the earth, at Nora's elbow. Her face was a map of wrinkles, but her eyes were bright, and she held Nora's hand, her gnarled, strong grip a silent blessing. And the blacksmith, a man as large as Nora, his face stained with soot, stood by Thomas. He had just, appeared. He nodded, his gaze respectful, man to man. The words were said, the names were signed, a line in a dusty book, a piece of paper. I suppose," the justice said, that makes you man and wife. That will be $2. Thomas paid him. They were on the steps, in the sun. It was over. The crowd was still there, cheated, confused. Thomas looked at Nora, his wife. The word was a cannonball. The word was a shield. The word was everything. He smiled. It was not his grim, tight smile. It was a real smile. It was slow. It reached his eyes. And in front of the crowd, in front of Mrs. Gable, in front of the whole damned judgmental world, he reached for her. He did not pull her. He put his hands on her waist, and he drew her to him. He held her, his gaze on her face, and he kissed her. It was a public kiss. It was a long, deep, thorough kiss. It was a kiss that said, "This is my wife. This is the woman I have chosen. This is the woman I am proud of." It was a kiss that silenced every whisper. When he let her go, she was blushing, her face a deep, beautiful red. The crowd began to move, to break apart, their show over, their judgment irrelevant. But Mrs. Gable was not done. She was shaking, her face pale with rage. "It is a sham," she hissed, her voice loud, carrying a wedding with a gun to his back. "It will not last. You cannot make a silk purse from a..." Mrs. Gable. Thomas's voice. It was not loud. It was not angry. It was flat. It was cold. It was the voice of the man who had held the rifle. She stopped. "Be very careful," he said, his voice quiet, his gaze lethal. "How you speak of my wife." The word "my wife." It hit her. It hit the whole street. It was a new fact, a new, hard, legal fact. Mrs. Gable's mouth snapped shut. The color drained from her face. She had been scolding a widow. She had been insulting. A whore. She was now insulting Mrs. Thomas Hayes, a landowner's wife, a respectable woman. She was beaten, and she knew it. She turned, her back stiff, and she walked away. Thomas watched her go. Then he turned to Nora. He helped her, and Grace, into the wagon. He climbed up beside her. He snapped the reins, and they turned, in a slow, proud circle, and they left. They headed home. The silence that followed his words was absolute. Mrs. Gable, her face white with fury, had no answer. The law, which she had tried to weaponize, had just been turned against her. She was not silencing a widow. She was now, in public, at risk of slandering a landowner's wife. She turned, her back rigid with defeated pride, and she did not walk, but marched, away from the scene, her companions scattering in her wake. The show was over. The crowd began to murmur, to shuffle, their free entertainment finished. They had seen the wedding, the kiss, the confrontation. It was time to return to their day. The wagon wheel creaked as Thomas put his foot on the hub, ready to climb back in. But he stopped. He looked at the dissolving crowd, at the men turning back to the saloon, at the women pulling their children close. He looked at the sheriff, who was already turning, with a sigh of relief, to go back to his office. This was not enough. He had silenced one woman. He needed to silence the town. He did not get into the wagon. He handed the reins to Nora, her eyes wide and still bright with the shock of the kiss. Met his. She took them, her hands, for the first time taking control of his property, of their property. Thomas turned. He put his foot on the hub, then on the wagon seat, and he stood. He was not a preacher. He was not a politician. He was a rancher. But as he stood, his large frame silhouetted against the morning sun, he became the highest point in Redemption Creek. He was higher than the sheriff's star, higher than the saloon doors, higher even than the cross on the church. The shuffling stopped. The crowd, sensing a new, final act, turned back. They were silent. His gaze was not angry. It was not the wild rage of the man who had struck the Reverend, nor the cold threat he had just delivered to Mrs. Gable. This was something new. This was the voice of a man who had drawn a line in the earth and was now inviting the world to look at it. "You have all seen," he said, his voice not a shout, but a deep, clear declaration that carried over the dust. "You have seen the law of this town. You have seen the sheriff, and you have seen the justice of the peace. Now, you will all hear mine." He paused, letting the words settle. He was not asking for their attention. He was commanding it. "My wife," he said, and the word was a brand, a claim, a shield. He looked down, just for a moment, at Nora, who was looking up at him, her face a mask of stunned, terrified, perfect trust. "My wife, Nora Hayes, and my daughter, Grace Hayes." He looked back at the crowd, at every averted eye, at every face that was now forced to look at him. "Anyone," he said, "man or woman, who speaks a word of insult against my wife. You speak that word against me. Anyone who offers her anything less than the respect she is due. You offer that disrespect to me. This town turned its back on my first wife. It will not turn its back on this one." A collective, sharp and drawn breath, the shame. He had brought the shame of Sarah's death, their shared, silent, communal sin, into the light, and he had laid it at their feet. Men who had stood with their hands in their pockets, judging, now looked down. They saw their own boots. They saw their own cowardice. The banker's wife, Mrs. Davies, who had held her skirts high from the market mud, her face flushed with a sudden, hot memory. She had been one of the women who had refused to help Sarah. "If any man," Thomas continued, his voice dropping, becoming harder, "threatens my wife or my child, if any man sets one foot on my land with anything other than good business or goodwill in his heart, you will not answer to the sheriff, you will not answer to the justice, you will answer directly to me." This was not just a warning, this was a new constitution. This was the founding law of the Hayes Ranch. Into this new, profound, and heavy silence, a new voice rose. "And you would have let that child die." It was Martha. She stepped off the boardwalk, her small, ancient frame moving into the street. She stood, a gnarled, gray prophet, and she looked at the crowd, her eyes as sharp and black as a magpie's. "I was there," she said, her voice a dry, carrying rasp. "I saw you all at the market." She did not need to point. They knew. "You pulled your dresses back, you averted your eyes, you whispered about his sin." She turned her gaze on Mrs. Thorne, the Reverend's wife, who was clutching a small, useless Bible in her hand. "You let a man plead for the life of his child, and you offered him gossip. You offered him judgment." She took another step until she was beside the wagon, one hand resting on the wheel. "You all talk of God. You talk of the Reverend's words. You talk of sin and righteousness. You would not know the face of God if he baked your very bread." She turned and she looked up at Nora. "This woman," Martha declared, her voice ringing. "This woman who you cast out. This woman who you called unclean. This woman who had just buried her own child. She did what not one of you God-fearing, righteous, clean women had the charity or the courage to do. She opened her arms. She offered her own body. She gave her own milk. This woman, is the only reason that child is alive. The moral compass of the town, in that one sharp, pointed speech, was not just questioned, it was shattered and then reset. The judgment of the market was reversed, the shame thrown back, hard into the faces of the accusers. "You look for your faith in a book," Martha spat, "and in a wooden building. I saw faith. It was in a cold room, in a boarding house. It was a woman offering life to a child when the world had offered her nothing but scorn. That is your Christian duty. You should be on your knees in gratitude to her." Thomas, standing on the wagon, heard it all. He heard the public validation. He heard the truth of the last 6 weeks, spoken aloud, spoken by the town's one true, undeniable conscience. He looked at the crowd. He saw Mrs. Thorne, her face ashen. He saw the sheriff nodding, slowly his gaze on Martha. And something in him, the tight, hot knot of rage and guilt he had carried since Sarah's death, the ghost that had ridden him, the ghost that told him, "You killed her. You killed her with your anger." It did not break. It dissolved. He had not saved Sarah. He would carry that to his grave, but he had not failed this time. He had taken his rage, his strength, his will, and he had not used it to strike a preacher. He had used it to build a wall, to draw a line. He had used it to protect his family. He had not let his anger be his sin. He had, at last, made it his shield. He looked down from his height, not as a sinner, but as a husband. He had done what a man was supposed to do. He had, finally, in his own way, forgiven himself. Nora felt the shift. She sat on the wagon seat, the reins in her hand, and the words "my wife" were no longer a shock. They were a weight, a good, solid, heavy weight, like a new, warm coat. She was not the hired nurse. She was not the grieving widow. She was not the town outcast. She was Mrs. Thomas Hayes. The garden was her garden. The patched roof was her roof. The man standing above her, a guardian, was her husband. A quiet, fierce, powerful sense of place settled over her. This was her land. This was her home. And the people in this street, they were, now, the outsiders. Into this profound, world-changing, absolute silence, a new sound came. It was a gurgle. Grace, who had slept through the rifle shot, slept through the vows, slept through the kiss, was awake. She was not crying. She was in Nora's arms, her eyes open, and she was looking up at the strange, new, moving shapes of the town. She let out a small, happy, perfectly healthy chuckle. It was the sound of a baby who was warm and fed and safe. The sound cut through the shame, the guilt, and the law. It was the final, undeniable witness. It was the living, breathing proof. It was the result. This life was what happened when compassion, when action was chosen over judgment. The crowd was baffled. They had come for a hanging or a shaming or a scandal, and they were left with a happy baby. They were left with a new, powerful, untouchable family. Thomas looked down. He saw Grace, her small, perfect mouth open. He saw Nora, her face, her strong, plain, beautiful face, looking up at him, a small, slow, real smile touching her lips. He had said what needed to be said. The law was declared. He stepped down from the seat, his movements sure, and he sat beside her. He took the reins from her hands. His hand, as it brushed hers, was warm. He did not look at the crowd again. He did not look at Martha. He did not look at the sheriff. He snapped the reins, a single, clean, sharp sound. The wagon lurched. The wheels creaked. They began to roll. They did not slink away. They did not flee. They departed. They rolled straight down the center of the street, past the silent, stunned, defeated faces. They rolled past the saloon. They rolled past the church. They rolled out of Redemption Creek. They left behind a town that was, for the first time, truly silent, a town whose old, cruel order had not just been challenged, it had been broken. As the wagon cleared the last building, as the open, clean, hard prairie opened up before them, Nora looked back. One last time. The crowd was just standing there, small, dark shapes in the dust, she knew, with a deep, weary certainty that this was not a final, perfect victory. The whispers would remain, misses. Gable would find new ways to hate. But it did not matter. The line had been drawn, the wall had been built. She turned her back on the town, and she faced forward. She faced home. She looked at the man beside her, her husband. He was looking at the road. He was taking them home. The ride home was not silent, but the sounds were new. The steady, untroubled creak of the wagon wheels, the soft jingle of the harness, the quiet, sleeping breath of Grace, held secure in Nora's arms. The silence was in them. It was not the hollow, aching silence of grief, nor the brittle, fearful silence of strangers. It was a silence that was full, a deep, heavy, settled quiet, like the calm that comes after a fever has broken. It was the sound of a thing that was, at last, truly finished. Nora held the child, Thomas held the reins. He did not look at her, but she could feel the stillness in him, the rigid, coiled spring of his anger. The one he had lived with for a year, the one that had defined him, was gone. His shoulders, which she had first seen stooped in exhaustion, were now simply settled. He was a man driving his wagon home. They arrived as the sun was beginning its descent, turning the hard, dusty prairie into a place of deep, liquid gold. The light was no longer an accuser. It was a blessing. It caught the new, bright, courageous green of the garden her garden. It warmed the wood of the mended chicken coop. It made the patched roof of the house look less like a scar and more like a testament. The ranch, which had been a place of despair, looked, in this light, like a promise. Thomas pulled the horse to a halt. He sat for a long moment, his hands resting on his thighs, just looking at the house, his house, their house. He got down, his movements slow, not with the ragged exhaustion of before, but with the weariness of a man who had fought a long, hard battle and had finally won. He did not walk to the side of the wagon to offer his hand. He came to her, to Nora. He stood in the golden dust, and he held up his arms, not for the baby, for her. She understood. With her hands free, Grace was still a warm, sleeping weight in the crook of one arm. She placed them on his shoulders. He did not help her down. He lifted her. His hands were strong and sure at her waist, taking her full weight, setting her on the ground as if she were not a large, heavy woman, but something precious, something fragile. She, who had never been seen as precious. She, who had learned, by necessity, never to be fragile. He did not let her go immediately. He kept his hands at her waist, a respectful, steadying touch. He looked at her face, which was smudged with dust and the tracks of her earlier, private tears, and he smiled. It was not his grimace. It was not the tight, pained smile of their shared, dark jokes. It was the slow, rare, real smile that had started in his heart and, after a long journey, had finally reached his eyes. "Welcome home," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp, and then he used the new word, the legal word, the name. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes." Nora had not cried on the ride. She had not cried when she had faced down the sheriff, nor when she had declared, "I choose him." She had not wept when he kissed her in the street. But the name Mrs. Hayes, it was not a shield. It was not a fortress. It was an identity. It was the public, spoken, legal acknowledgement of herself. It was the sound of a door, not being barred against the world, but being unlocked from the inside. A single, hot, stinging tear broke free, then another. They were not the sobs of grief. They were the quiet, painful, overflowing tears of a deep, profound, and utterly unexpected healing. A small, watery, hiccuping laugh escaped her. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered. He did not answer. He just nodded, his own eyes bright, his throat working. He let his hands fall from her waist. He gently, so gently, took the sleeping Grace from her arms. He carried his daughter, their daughter, across the porch and into the house. Nora followed. She stopped at the threshold. The last time she had crossed it, she had been a refugee, a hired nurse, a woman with no name and no place. She wiped the tears from her cheeks with a dusty hand, and she stepped inside, into her home. The air was cool and still. It smelled of the pot of beans, simmering on the back of the stove. It smelled of the faint, lingering, holy scent of yeast. It smelled of wood smoke. It smelled safe. The new life began. It began not with a declaration, but with the quiet, steady rhythm of shared work. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table, the table they had stood on in the storm. It felt different now. It felt theirs. Grace was asleep in the new crib Thomas had built, the one he had sanded for hours until the wood was as smooth as water. He did not just eat, he planned. He had a small, worn, leather-bound book open, the one where he kept the ranch's accounts. He had a pencil. "The north fence," he said. His voice was hesitant, as if the idea of sharing these burdens was new and fragile. "It is good, but the creek, it is low for the garden, for your garden. We will need a new irrigation ditch." She sat across from him. She had her own books, the paper packets of seeds, spread out like a hand of winning cards. "The beans are in," she said, her own voice just as quiet, "but the squash will need more room. They will need that water, a great deal of water." They were not talking about ditches or about squash. They were talking about a future. They were planning a harvest. They were together, in the quiet lamplight, building a life. He looked up from his book, his gaze meeting hers. "I will need to hire a hand, a new one, for the fences, for the barn roof, the heavy work." Nora's voice, when she replied, was not hesitant, it was firm. "He will need to be a good man," she said. "A quiet man, a man who shows respect for this house and for its mistress." "Yes," Thomas said, a slow, deep understanding passing between them. "Yes, that is the new law of this house. Respect." The house rules, born of violence and defense, were now becoming the laws of their daily bread. The next week, that abstract partnership became solid. The rest of the roof, not just the patch, needed mending. It was not a crisis, like the storm. It was a project. "I cannot do it alone," he said, standing in the yard, looking up. "You are not alone," she said. She put Grace in her basket, in the shade of the one good tree. Thomas set the heavy ladder against the house. He climbed up, his hammer in his belt. And Nora stood at the bottom. She was his ground crew. She was his partner. When he was ready for a new bundle of shingles, he would call, and she would lift. Her large, strong arms, her powerful back, the body that had been her shame, she used it. She lifted the heavy, awkward bundles up to him, a steady, tireless supply. They worked all day in the high, hot sun. There was only the sound of the wind, the scrape of the shingles, and the steady, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of his hammer. It was the sound of a home being built. And Grace was growing. She was no longer a tiny, fragile creature. She was 3 months old, then 4. She had cheeks. She rolled over, a feat of such magnitude that they both stopped, hearts in their throats, to watch. Then one day, on a clean blanket on the porch, the sun warm, they tried. Thomas sat on one side, his boot heel braced. Nora sat on the other, her skirts a soft barrier, and in the middle, they propped her. Grace sat. She wobbled, she listed to the left, and Thomas's strong leg was there. She tilted to the right, and Nora's soft, solid form was there. But for 1, 2, 3 full seconds, she sat unsupported. A laugh, a real, sudden, surprised bark of a laugh, burst from Thomas, and Nora, seeing his face, his unguarded joy, she laughed too. It was the first time Nora realized she'd ever heard him laugh. It was a good sound. It was the sound of joy. The trap of poverty, the one that had held them both, began to loosen its grip. The mended hens laid every day, a dozen, sometimes more. Perfect brown eggs, the garden. The garden gave. It gave back beans and squash and new, sweet corn, a testament to the rich soil and the good water. And Nora baked. She found the old summer kitchen, a small brick and wood building behind the house, unused for years. The oven was huge, a deep, black-mouthed cavern. It was full of leaves and old nests. She cleaned it, she swept it, she fed it wood, and she brought it back to life. She baked not 1 loaf, not the few she had carried to the market. She baked 20, the scent, the smell of yeast and crust and honor. It was not a small, defiant smell in a hostile market. It was a great, warm, generous cloud. It covered the ranch. It rolled out on the wind, a proclamation. Her bread was no longer a symbol of her need. It was a symbol of her abundance. The new order, the one declared in town, began to spread. A wagon came up the road. It was not a fast, bold wagon. It was slow, hesitant. Nora saw it from the porch. Thomas came out of the barn, his hand, by instinct, resting near his hip. It was a woman, a young woman from town, one Nora had seen but never spoken to. The woman was holding a baby, a tiny, thin baby, a baby that was crying, a weak, thready, familiar cry. The woman stopped the wagon. She was weeping, her face a mask of shame and terror. "Please," the woman whispered, not even getting down. I heard what Martha said in town. I was there." She looked at Nora, her eyes pleading. "My milk. It is not enough. He is starving. I have no money. I have nothing. But please, ma'am, Mrs. Hayes, could you, just once." The echo, the words. Thomas's hand, the one on his hip, relaxed. He watched his wife. Nora looked at the woman. She did not ask her name. She did not ask if her husband was a sinner. She did not ask if she had been one of the women who had whispered. She just saw the mother. She just saw the child. "Yes," Nora said, her voice quiet and strong. "Bring him in. The fire is warm, and I have bread." She had become the sanctuary. But the work, it healed, but it did not erase. The scars remained. Nora still, sometimes, caught her reflection in the dark glass of the window at night or in the mirror. She had moved her things. She was in the big bedroom, in the big bed, their bed, but the cracked mirror, the one from the attic room in town, she had brought it. She did not know why. She had hung it in the small, empty room, the one that had been her first. He found her there, one afternoon, just staring at it, staring at the broken, disjointed image of herself. "It is a liar," he said, his voice quiet from the doorway. She did not turn. "It shows what is there," she whispered. It is broken. It is a monster." He walked in. He stood behind her. His hands, large and warm, came to rest on her shoulders. They looked together at the reflection, the tall, strong man and the large, broken, reflected woman. "I see," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A woman. I see a woman who can build a chicken coop and mend a roof and plant a garden and bake bread that tastes like a prayer." He turned her, gently, physically, away from the mirror to face him. "I see the woman who saved my daughter. I see the woman who saved me. I see my wife." "That," he said, his gaze steady, "is all I see." The town learned, slowly. The sheriff, Brody, he rode out, not on official business. He came on a Saturday, when he knew the smell of the bread was on the wind. He stopped his horse at the porch. Nora was there, Grace on her hip, her face calm. "Ma'am," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Hayes, I heard you were baking for sale." "I am," she said. He coughed, his large frame awkward. He looked at the sky. He looked at his horse's ear. I will take a loaf. If you have one to spare, I will pay." She went inside. She came back with a large, beautiful, dark-crusted loaf, wrapped in a clean, white cloth. He took it. He handed her the coins. That day," he said, his voice low, his eyes still not quite meeting hers. "In town, I was doing my job. That is all, but I am sorry for the way of it." He did not wait for an answer. He did not wait for absolution. He just nodded, turned his horse, and rode away. The apology was clumsy. It was late, but it was made. The nights. The nights were the best. The work was done. The new, respectful, hired hand was in his quarters. The chickens were roosting. The fire was low. Grace was asleep in her crib. They sat on the porch. The air was cool. The stars were a riot. "The roof," he said, into the quiet. It held. "Yes," she said. "It did." A small silence. "The garden," she said. "It is growing." "Yes," he said. "It is." Another, longer, more comfortable silence. "Grace," he said, his voice softer. She is laughing." "Yes," she whispered. "She is." He reached out, in the dark. He did not grab. He found her hand, her large, strong, capable hand, his own, calloused and scarred, closed around it. They fit. "We were so broken," she said, her voice a small sound in the vast, quiet dark. "We were," he agreed. "The baby," she said. "The market. I thought I was cursed." "Nora," he said, and his thumb, rough, brushed across her knuckles. You saved me." She turned her hand in his. She laced her fingers with his. She held on. "No, Thomas," she said, her voice clear and strong and full. "We saved each other as—" Spring came again. It was not the false, hesitant spring of the previous year, but a deep, confident season of impossible green. The land, which had been gray and choked, had responded to the water and the care. The garden, Nora's garden, was a riot of life. The rows straight, the soil dark, the plants reaching for the sun. The ranch was no longer a place of survival. It was a place of abundance. The sound of the hammer on the new barn roof was a steady, companionable rhythm. But it was not Thomas's hammer. It was Abraham, the new hired hand, a quiet, older man with a steady gaze and a respect for the law of the house. Thomas was not hammering. He was on his knees. He was on his knees on the front porch, which was no longer sagging but had been rebuilt, the planks level and new. "Come on, Grace," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble, a sound Nora had never heard him use with anyone but the child. "You can do it. One more. Come to Pa." Grace, who was no longer a tiny, swaddled bundle, but a solid, determined child of nearly 1 year, stood. She was unsteady, her small, bare feet planted on the warm wood. She had her mother's solid build and her father's stubborn eyes. She let go of the porch post. She wobbled. She looked at her father, who was holding his hands out, his face a mask of such profound, ridiculous, open-hearted love that it made Nora's own heart ache. Grace took one step. She wavered, her arms pinwheeling. "You have got her," Nora said, her voice quiet. "From the doorway?" Grace took a second step, and then she fell, a soft, deliberate plop, onto the seat of her diapered bottom. She did not cry. She looked at the distance between herself and her father, looked at her own failure, and let out a single, sharp, frustrated squeak. Thomas laughed, a full, deep, easy laugh. He crawled on his knees and scooped her up, burying his face in her neck, making a sound that made her shriek with delight. She is a storm," he said, his voice muffled, as he held her. "She is a hurricane." "She is your daughter," Nora said, smiling. She wiped a stray trace of flour from her cheek. The air around her, the air of the whole house, was thick with the scent of new bread. She came out onto the porch, her own large, capable body moving with a new, unhurried grace. She was not the gaunt, haunted woman from the boarding house. Her face was full, her skin clear. She was still a large woman, but she was no longer at war with the space she occupied. She owned it. "That smile," Thomas said, his voice quiet, his eyes on her. He was still holding Grace, who was now pulling at his ear. "That one. Right there." She blushed. Even now, after a year, his quiet, steady admiration could make her blush. "I will," he said, not to her, but as a vow to the prairie, to the sky. "Spend the rest of my life making sure that stays." It was not a poem. It was not a grand, romantic declaration. It was a statement of work. It was a promise of labor, like the fences, like the roof, like the garden. It was the most profound and the most real declaration of love he could make. She did not answer. She just put her hand on his shoulder, a strong, flour-dusted hand, and leaned in, her cheek resting on the top of Grace's soft, wild hair. They were a family, not a chosen family, not anymore, just a family. The ranch had been healed. The land itself, which had been starved by drought and neglect, now gave back. The creek, channeled by the new ditch, watered the garden, the fences held, the chickens laid. The world, which had been a hostile, brutal force, had been met with steady, disciplined care, and it had, in its own slow, natural way, surrendered. It had responded. Nora's own body, the one she had seen as a curse, a broken, monstrous thing. It had been the first to heal. It had given life to Grace, and now it was a source of life for the community. The oven, the great brick oven in the summer kitchen, it was her cathedral. She baked, not just for them, but for others. The ranch had a new name, whispered in town. The bakery, they called it, but it was spoken with respect. The young woman, Mary, the one who had come, weeping with a starving child. She was here, today. She came every week. Her son, no longer starving, was now a chubby, healthy toddler, playing in the clean dust by the porch steps with a wooden spoon. And there was another, the blacksmith's boy, a shy, quiet child of 7, had ridden out on his pony. He was here to collect the 2 loaves his father had ordered. Nora came out of the summer kitchen, her face flushed from the heat, her apron white with flour. She carried 2 perfect dark brown loaves, the crust crackling, the smell a kind of prayer. "Here you are, young man," she said, her voice warm. She had not, she realized, been the object of fear or scorn or pity for a very long time. She was just Nora, Mrs. Hayes, the woman who baked. She handed the boy the bread, and she handed a 3rd loaf, one she had not been asked for, to Mary. "No, ma'am," Mary whispered, her face flushing. I cannot." "It is bread," Nora said, her voice gentle but firm. "Children must eat the garden. It gave us more squash than we can say grace over. Take it and take the squash." She was no longer the one who was deprived. She was the one who gave. The circle was closed. Her own brokenness, her own self-hatred, it was gone. She still saw the cracked mirror, which she had never thrown away. It was still in the small room, but it no longer held a monster. It held the truth. It held a woman who was strong, and who was loved, and who was, in her own way, just as fractured and just as beautiful as the glass itself. She had accepted her own strong, large, capable body. She was, at last, at peace. And Thomas, his rage, the thing that had defined him, that had killed his first wife and almost destroyed him, it was gone. Not gone, perhaps, but tamed. It was a fire he now used, not to burn, but to warm. He was a father, he was a husband, he was a builder. He had, at last, taken control of the storm inside him. The community. It was changing. Not fast, not all at once. Mrs. Gable, Nora had heard, still spoke of them with a sour tongue. But no one listened. The sheriff, Brody, bought his bread every week. The blacksmith sent his son. And Mary, the young mother. She was the first of a new, slow, hesitant trickle. The ranch was no longer an outcast place. It was a sanctuary. There were plans. They had talked. On the porch, in the dark, a new planting season, a new room, built onto the side of the house, for the children. A small sign, perhaps, at the end of the road, Hayes's Bakery, Saturdays. It was a future. It was not a future of grand, easy, sunlit days. It would be a future of work, of drought and hail and sickness and fear, but it would not be a future they faced alone. the blacksmith's boy, and Mary, and her son. They were gone. The sun was low, the smell of the bread and the rich, dark earth of the garden and the cool water from the creek, it all mingled in the evening air. Thomas, his chores done, the new hired hand paid and gone, came to the porch. He sat on the top step, his back against the post. Nora came out and sat beside him, her skirts settling around her. They sat hand in hand in the quiet. Grace, her face scrubbed clean, her belly full, her small body dressed in a simple cotton nightgown, was on the blanket at their feet. She was not walking, she was crawling, with a single-minded, determined focus toward a moth that was fluttering in the last of the light. She reached it, her small, fat, perfect hand closed around it, and then she opened her hand, she looked at the moth in her palm, and she smiled, a smile of pure, uncomplicated, simple, perfect joy. Thomas looked at her, and then he looked at Nora, his wife, his partner, the woman who had, in the market, in the dust, looked at him and not seen a sinner, but a father. "We did it," he said, his voice a quiet rumble, not to her, but to the stars that were just beginning to prick the deep, purple velvet of the sky. She knew what he meant, the ranch, the child, the life. She turned her hand in his, lacing her fingers with his. They sat on the porch of the house they had built, the home they had made, and they watched their daughter, who had, at last, let the moth go, and was now staring, with wide, bright eyes, at the rising moon. She looked at him, his profile strong and quiet in the dusk. He looked at her face, in the dim light, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. And they spoke, their voices one, a single, shared, quiet truth, spoken into the vast healing silence of the prairie. We saved each other. Thank you for listening to this story from Wild West Tales. We have come to the end of this long journey, and it means the world to have shared it with you. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Please, leave a comment below and let us know, so we can all share in this community. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, Wild West Night, and giving this video a like. And if you want to help this story reach even more people, please hit that hype button to show your support. Thank you. From the bottom of our hearts, we will see you on the next trail.